In the dim hush of history before engines roared and before the world's maps were fully drawn, there was a quiet rhythm to commerce that seemed almost like breathing. A slow in and out that carried men and women across seas and deserts in search of goods both precious and strange. And among these goods, none were as coveted, as mysterious, and as quietly powerful as spices. Cinnamon bark coiled into tight brown scrolls, nutmeg seeds, like polished stones, peppercorns, dark and biting saffron threads, glowing with the color of fire, and cardamom pods that seemed to whisper perfume into the air. Each one small, fragile, easily overlooked, and yet each one worth its weight in silver or gold, for in them lay not only flavor but stories, stories of lands unseen, rituals unknown, meals transformed in medicines, believed to cure or strengthen, stories that gave ordinary lives a touch of wonder. And so it was that spice merchants became the threads that stitched together faraway places, connecting the humid coasts of India with the stony streets of Rome, perfumed markets of Arabia with the chilly kitchens of northern Europe. And to imagine the life of such a merchant is to imagine a journey not marked by conquest or by war, but by persistence, patience, and endless days of motion, days measured in footsteps on sand and the rocking of boats on endless blue, days marked by the clink of scales in marketplaces and the soft rustle of sacks being tied shut, days scented with cloves, ginger, frankincense, and myrrh. So that to follow the path of a spice merchant is to follow a slow heartbeat of the ancient world, a heartbeat that echoed in ports, in caravanserais, in city squares, and even in quiet homes where, far from their places of origin, spices were sprinkled into bread, stirred into broths, burned as incense, or locked away as treasures. But who were these merchants? What did they carry? And how did these fragile luxuries bridge the gaps between worlds as different as ice and fire? The answer lies in the very nature of spices, in their delicate essence, so easily lost. It demanded not just transport, but care, a gentle hand that understood the language of sun-dried leaves and wood smoke, of shells and citrus peel, a knowledge that transformed raw nature into bottled fragrance guarded closely by those who dared to brave the unknown. It took them across the sea, over mountains and through valleys where dangers lurked, but so did opportunities. For every merchant who reached his destination safely, there were tales of others who did not. Storms that swallowed ships whole, bandits that made sand run red with spilled blood, and market days when fortunes were made and lost with the turn of a hand. But still they came, driven by the lure of distant riches, seeking not just spices, but the secrets behind their power. They bartered not just for goods, but for stories, weaving a grand narrative that wove through the lives of kings and commoners alike. Can you imagine what it was like to enter a Roman kitchen, for example, where the aroma of fresh bread mingled with the sharp tang of vinegar and the heady scent of cinnamon? Or picture the sun-drenched patios of Arab homes where mint tea mingled with the sweet, earthy fragrance of cardamom. And how about the cozy hearths of northern European cottages where the bitter warmth of cloves filled the air? Chasing away the winter chill, in each place spices were more than just flavor. They were portals to faraway lands, gifts brought back by travelers. And merchants, each grain telling a tale of adventure, each pinch adding a layer to the rich tapestry of global trade. They were part of a silent exchange, a whispered conversation between the known and the unknown, between the familiar and the exotic, a testament to human curiosity, daring, and the eternal quest for something new. The merchant's life, then, was more than just a profession. It was a calling that demanded not just physical endurance, but a kind of emotional resilience, a patience to weather the storms, both literal and metaphorical, that tested their resolve. To be a spice merchant was to carry the weight of expectations, to navigate treacherous waters, not just for precious cargo, but for the dreams and desires of people who never saw the sea, who relied on these intrepid travelers to bring the flavors and fragrances of the world to their tables and their homes. It was a responsibility that ran deeper than trade, touching upon the very essence of how people experience the world around them. So if you're ever in the quiet comfort of your own home, surrounded by the familiar sense of your everyday life, pause for a moment and close your eyes. Imagine the journeys that brought these spices to your plate, the hands that harvested them, the ships that transported them, and and the merchants who risked everything to bring a little bit of the world to your table? For in doing so, you'll understand that every spice has a story, and every story has a flavor. The docks, always the beginning and always the ending of a merchant's tale. Stretched wide beneath a pale sky where gulls wheeled slowly and the sea whispered in its restless language, it was here, at this threshold between land and water, that the spice merchant's world seemed both smallest and largest. For on the planks beneath his feet were simple, ordinary things. Ropes coiled like sleeping serpents, wooden crates stacked in uneven towers, barrels sealed with pitch and marked with chalk, sailors shouting to one another as they hauled sails or checked knots. Yet all around these familiar details was a sense of vastness, of distance folded into every object, for within those crates might lie cinnamon that had grown on a distant hillside under a sun far hotter than this one, or peppercorns gathered by careful hands in jungles so green they seemed eternal, or saffron plucked one thread at a time from crocus blossoms on wind-blown plains. And these spices, small though they were, carried with them the echo of landscapes and peoples unseen, so that even as the dock bustled with the everyday sounds of hammering of boots, thudding of waves slapping against stone, it also hummed with unseen horizons, and the merchant, standing quietly with his ledger tucked under one arm, felt himself part of this wider weaving, a single figure in the endless exchange that tied coast to coast. He smelled the tar, sharp and pungent, mixing with the sweeter waft of cargo, nutmeg, cloves, frankincense, and he knew that before the day ended, sacks would be hoisted onto ships bound westward, toward hungry markets, and others unloaded from vessels that had crept across seas in patient arcs, bringing with them not just goods, but news, songs, and accents. And though the laborers might grunt and sweat, though sailors might curse the weight of damp rope, all of it moved with a rhythm that seemed almost timeless, as if the dock itself were breathing in, drawing ships close, and breathing out, letting them depart again. And within this rhythm, the spice merchant found his place. His role both humble and significant, for he was not the one to row or to sail, not the one to climb rigging or patch sails, but the one who measured, weighed, bargained, and recorded, ensuring that the small seeds and fragile barks that traveled farther than most men ever would arrived safely into new hands. And in this careful, deliberate work lay his livelihood, his reputation, and the story we now follow, beginning not with thunder or clash, but with the slow creak of wood beneath his boots, the soft roll of tide against the pier, and the quiet certainty that every journey begins and ends with the docks, where the world narrows into planks and ropes, yet opens into oceans and continents beyond imagination. Cinnamon, the very word, held the essence of its namesake tree, all warm brown hues and winding trails that climbed toward the sky. He knew its source as intimately as he knew the lines on his own palms, the sprawling gardens of a Zamorian aristocrat, how sunlight dripped through emerald leaves to paint dappled patterns on the red gold bark, how expert hands, guided by generations of knowledge, peeled away the outer skin to find the inner treasure, how each strip was wound tight, a stave in some long-forgotten song. And he knew the journey, too, across the turquoise expanse where ocean met horizon, following the lazy dance of the monsoon winds, riding the swells to the blessed shores where palm trees swayed and dhows awaited, patiently anchored in the harbor like half-submerged dreams. And still, after all this, he was uncertain what song the cinnamon would weave into when it reached the hands of master perfumers. Would it intertwine with orange peel and myrrh to craft a scent fit for kings? Or mingle with wood smoke and amber in a potion meant to ward off evil? Perhaps it would end up in a simple syrup, its fiery spirit tamed to sweeten a beggar's bread. All of these futures and more were contained in the crates awaiting his inspection. Each box was a closed book, its contents revealed only to those who possessed the key to spices. A lifetime spent among their heady aromas had honed his senses. Subtle variations in hue, the merest shift in texture, told tales of where and how a spice was grown, how long it had traveled, whether it had encountered fire or flood along the way. They whispered stories of sun-drenched fields and moonlit groves, of ancient rituals and bustling marketplaces. With calloused thumb, he traced the fine dusting on an ornately carved box. Feeling the ghost of cinnamon leaves against his skin, opening it, he breathed deep, anchoring himself to the present with a grunt, the rich, familiar scent anchoring him like a lifeline, grounding him amidst a sea of possibilities. Today's cargo had made the long journey well, its essence intact, ready to embark on its next set of adventures, to be reborn as incense. Curling heavenward as a vibrant dye-staining cloth, the color of sunset as a piquant seasoning, transforming a peasant stew into fit food for a king. Its potential was boundless. But then, weren't they all? The cumin, coriander, cardamom, turmeric? Each a universe unto itself, a universe the spice merchant had made his life's work to understand. One by one, he examined the boxes, muttering to himself, checking measurements against his notes, testing the weight of bundles, sniffing deeply, searching for flaws. A wormhole's tooth, a moth's caress, anything that betrayed neglect or trickery. Satisfied, he made his marks, initialed the ledgers with a flourish, committing their stories to paper, sealing the deals with a handshake. His customers a rogues' gallery of nobles, tradesmen, cut purses, all seeking fortune or favor through the trade in exotic flavors, would arrive. Soon enough, eager to claim their wares and carry the threads of distant lands back into the loom of the city. Their faces, a kaleidoscope of cultures, would soon replace the somber sky, bringing with them laughter, haggling, and the low murmur of promises and perils. For within these fragrant walls, the spice merchant didn't just trade goods, he trafficked in tales, weaving a tapestry of flavors and fancies that bound the world together, one scent at a time. As the sun began its slow dip toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the docks, he felt the day's work easing into his bones, a familiar ache of satisfaction. Another voyage complete, another tale added to the grand narrative that flowed through his veins like the sap of cinnamon. Yet even as weariness tugged at him, the call of the open sea, the lure of faraway shores, the whisper of new arrivals due tomorrow kept him rooted to the spot, eyes scanning the horizon, ever vigilant for the next ship bearing new stories, new spices, new songs to add to the endless symphony of the docks. The morning hours at the docks always began with a kind of hushed expectancy, stillness that did not mean silence but rather the layering of countless small sounds, the groan of timbers adjusting to the tide, the hollow clatter of amphorae being rolled into place, the scratch of quills against parchment as clerks tallied goods, and above it all, the faint cries of gulls circling endlessly, their wings cutting against the brightening sky. For the spice merchant, this early hour was one of quiet observation. When the chaos of loading and unloading had not yet reached its feverish rhythm, when men still paused to stretch their backs before lifting another crate, and when the scents, unbroken by the press of too many bodies, drifted clean and distinct upon the sea air, making it possible to separate pepper from cloves, cinnamon from cardamom, the resinous tang of frankincense from the citrus-like snap of coriander, he would stand at the edge of the pier, ledger open in hand, eyes narrowing as each cargo was checked, his lips moving silently as he matched the tally marks against his memory. And though to a passerby this might look like nothing more than dull arithmetic, to him it was as essential as the ropes binding the ships to their moorings. For one mistake, a missing sack, a mislabeled barrel, a spice dampened by seawater and left to rot, could mean not just loss of profit, but loss of trust. And trust was the true coin of his trade. Yet beyond the figures and the parchment, there was another kind of awareness, quieter, subtler one, that belonged not to numbers, but to the senses. For the merchant knew that every port had its own mood, its own particular timbre, and today the air seemed kind. The wind carrying warmth rather than chill, the workers moving with steadiness rather than haste, the gulls swooping but not shrieking, and in such moments he felt the favor of fortune itself, as if the world had briefly aligned to ease his passage. Still he remained cautious, for the sea was never to be trusted fully, and though the horizon lay, serene and silver under the rising sun, he knew that storms could brew unseen, and so he checked again the sealing of his cargo. The marks upon his sacks, the tightness of knots binding the barrels until at last satisfied, he closed the ledger with a soft thump, tucked it under his arm and breathed deeply of the mingled scents that defined his livelihood, letting them anchor him in this moment. The moment before departure, the calm at the edge of the unknown, when the dock was both a cradle and a threshold, holding him for just a breath longer, before it would release him into the slow, inexorable current of trade that had carried so many merchants before him. would carry countless more long after he was gone, each one beginning with this same mixture of noise and stillness, salt and spice, expectation and memory. From the very earliest days, people have always been on the move, driven by a desire for new lands, different lives, or simply the need to survive. They've explored coastlines, crossed mountains, and sailed oceans. Some traveled as conquerors or traders, some as refugees or entertainers, and some merely because the road was there and beckoned to their wandering feet. But however they came to set out on their journeys, one thing was always certain: the travelers themselves were never truly alone. Wherever human beings have gone, other human beings have gone before them, leaving behind stories of what lies ahead. Tales of triumphs and tragedies, warnings and wisdoms. And wherever they journeyed, their presence reshaped the world around them. Sometimes for the better, sometimes for the worse. And nowhere is this truer than on the bustling waterfront of a busy port city. For here, where the land meets the sea, and merchants count their fortunes, there is a constant coming and going of people, each with their own tale to tell. There are sailors fresh from distant shores, soldiers returning from hard-fought campaigns, scholars eager to share their discoveries, and pilgrims on their way to sacred sites. All leave their mark on the city, bringing with them new ideas, goods and stories that mingle with the locals, transforming the city in subtle and sometimes dramatic ways. In the heart of the action are the workers, men who move with the practiced grace born of years of labor under the hot sun. Their muscles corded, forearms thick with sinew, and hands calloused and scarred. These men are the pulse of the docks. Their strength and endurance tested daily as they unload barrels heavier than a man's torso, carry crates up steep ramps and shoulder poles to steady swaying ships, with shoulders that speak the memory of countless sacks and palms thickened by rope burns. Splinters and salt ground deep into their skin. Their bodies are living tallies of their years at sea. As they move across the planks in their steady rhythm, one can see how they carry not only weight, but also the entire machinery of trade upon their backs. For without them, the ships would not be emptied, the warehouses would not be filled, and the spices that carried such value would remain only potential profit. Yet for all the magnitude of their labor, their presence is quiet, even unremarkable to those who do not look closely. And perhaps that was why the spice merchant took time to observe them, to note the way their laughter broke between grunts, to notice how their speech carried accents from a dozen regions. For these men, too, had come from far away, drifting from one port to another, tied not by ledgers or wealth, but by the daily necessity of work. One sang softly to himself in a tongue the merchant did not know, a chant that kept his steps steady as he carried amphora after amphora, while another whistled, his tune thin but cheerful, even as sweat traced lines across his dust-streaked face. Pairs of men leaned their backs against each other for a moment as rest, before returning to their labor. And in their camaraderie, there was a rhythm as ancient as the trade itself, one that spoke of survival more than ambition, of days strung together not by fortunes made, but by bread earned. And yet, in their small ways, they too touched the farthest edges of the world. For the sacks on their shoulders carried cinnamon once bark on a tree thousands of miles away. The amphorae they rolled contained oil pressed from olives that drank the sun of another shore. The crates they pushed held nutmeg, a seed that grew only in lands many here would never see. And though their pay would not buy more than the next meal or the next jug of wine, their labor was the bridge by which distant worlds met. And the merchant, who measured value in coin and contracts, did not forget this truth. Behind every careful tally in his ledger lay 100 bent backs, 100 footsteps, 100 hands gripping rough wood until splinters drew blood. So he stood silently for a while, letting his gaze rest on these men, watching the way their movements synchronized into a living machinery, their voices weaving into the background hum of the dock, until it seemed that the entire place, from the gulls to the waves to the groaning planks, was one vast instrument playing out the eternal music of commerce. And within that music, his own part was small, but steady. Another note in the song of trade, ready to move forward as soon as the tide allowed. This is a port. Its air is thick with scents, sounds, and textures, a living tapestry woven with the threads of 1,000 stories. The very air seems to hum with the murmur of dock workers, the slap of ropes, the cries of gulls, and the endless shuffle of feet on weathered planks. To the unpracticed eye, it may seem a jumble of sights and sounds, a cacophony of motion. But to the spice merchant, it is a well-known song. Each note, each nuance is as familiar to him as the lines on his own palm. He has listened to this symphony for so long that its music flows in his veins. Take, for instance, that omnipresent temps of salt. It's the constant refrain of this concerto, sharp and bracing, clinging to skin and beard, leaving its ghost upon his lips. That's the sea's own voice, ever present, yet never the same. For woven into this salt are 1,000 whispers. There's the acrid smoke of pitch bubbling in cauldrons, a low, dark note that speaks of long voyages and distant lands. Hear that sweet, resinous undertone? That's the scent of frankincense rising from crates that have been pried open for inspection. Above it, the faint animal musk of hides used to bind cargo, a smell that tells of journeys on land as well as sea. And just beyond the pier, the sour tang of fish unloaded at a neighboring pier. Mingling with the brine to create a counterpoint of sorts, a brief, sharp stab that cuts through the other smells. But above all, soaring above these, the bright notes of the spices themselves, each carrying their own story, cinnamon, warm and woody, like memories of hearth fires in far-off lands. Pepper, sharp and quick, its scent as lively as the crackle of musketry. Cloves, deep and heavy with perfume, whispering of moonlit gardens in some far eastern realm. Saffron, delicate and elusive, like sunlight caught in threads, its fragrance as ephemeral as the morning mist. And to most, these scents would blur into a single overwhelming haze, a wall of aroma that muddies the senses. But the merchant has trained himself to separate them, to detect the faintest taint of dampness in a sack, the faintest whiff of rot that might betray careless storage. This vigilance, quiet though it seems, is as important as his ledger. For a merchant's fortune can vanish in the space of one spoiled shipment. Yet it is not only the nose that is called into service here. Beneath his hands, the textures tell their own truths. The coarse weave of jute sacks, rough and fibrous, biting into the skin when lifted, a tactile reminder of the distance traveled. The hard edges and swaying looms of a foreign loom, the smoother surfaces of amp-free, cool with morning dew, a fleeting touch that speaks of long necks and nimble fingers, the grain of wooden crates sometimes splintered, sometimes sanded to a sheen, telling tales of sun-drenched fields or bustling workshops. In those ropes that bind them, stiff with salt or softened by use, each one bearing silent witness to the journey it has endured. And then beneath his feet, the dock planks themselves, worn by generations of boots, soaked with centuries of seawater, groaning under the weight of ages, sometimes creaking in protest, sometimes sighing with weariness. And sometimes, when the wind is just right, he thinks he can feel the heartbeat of the port itself pulsing up through the wood. Steady and slow, an ancient rhythm that has outlasted kings and empires. In this symphony of sensation, the spice merchant finds his anchor, the hub of his world. Here where the earth and water meet and mingle, where the paths of 1,000 travelers converge, he feels most at home. For he knows that when he is far out at sea, rocked by waves and star-guided skies, it will be these impressions that anchor him. The smell of pitch, the rasp of rope, the groan of planks, the mingled perfumes of spices and sea, weaving together into a memory strong enough to remind him why he set out at all, why he endures the dangers of travel, and why, despite its demands, the life of a spice merchant is one he could never forsake. As the sun climbed higher and the first true heat of the day began to shimmer upon the water, the quiet expectancy of the morning gave way to the deliberate preparations of departure. The spice merchant felt the subtle shift as surely as if the dock itself had exhaled. Sailors once lingering in idle chatter, now tightened ropes with swift precision, their hands moving in practiced knots. While others climbed the rigging, their silhouettes cutting against the pale sky as they unfurled sails that caught the breeze with a deep fabric cracking sigh. And on the planks below, porters hurried to complete their final tasks, rolling the last barrels into place, stacking sacks until they bulged like great earthen pillows, hammering lids into crates and marking them with signs that only merchants and customs men could read. Amid this bustle, the merchant moved quietly, ledger in hand, checking once more, always once more, for caution was his truest companion. And as each item was ticked and each mark confirmed, a calm settled in his chest. Not the excitement of adventure, but the measured satisfaction of readiness. For a journey began not with the sight of a new horizon, but with the certainty that nothing had been left undone. Yet even in this careful order, there lingered a sense of melancholy, for departure always carried with it a leaving behind. And as he glanced around the dock, at the workers whose backs were bent over crates, at the gulls swooping low in search of scraps, at the warehouse doors yawning open in the morning light, he felt the familiar tug of separation, the knowledge that soon the lines would be cast off, the gap between ship and pier widening, until the dock became only a strip of wood and stone retreating into memory. He allowed himself a moment of stillness then, breathing deeply of the mingled scents, listening to the layered chorus of the port, imprinting it in his mind as a traveler imprints the sight of a familiar home. For he knew that at sea there would be nights when the silence pressed too thickly, when the waves seemed too endless, and it was then that such memories became lanterns in the dark. At last the call was given, sharp but not hurried, and the ropes, stiff with salt and damp from spray, were uncoiled from their moorings, sliding heavily into the water with a splash. The ship shuddering slightly as if awakening from sleep, and the merchant stepped aboard with steady feet. The ledger pressed against his side, his mind already turning to the days ahead. Behind him, the dock stretched into the sun, still alive with its endless rhythm, but already it was receding, becoming less a place and more a chapter, a scene folded gently into the story of his journey. And as the sails bellied with the breeze and the ship leaned into the water, he felt the familiar motion take hold, the slow rocking, the creak of timbers, the murmur of waves, and with it came the quiet certainty that the voyage had begun. Not with fanfare or clamor, but with the same patience and softness that defined all trade. A rhythm as steady as breathing, carrying him forward into the great unfolding of the world. The overland journey began not with sudden change, but with gradual, a subtle shift that went almost unnoticed, until it was too late to turn back. It happened when the merchant left behind the scent of brine and tar and found himself, instead, in the wide, dusty breadth of inland roads, where the horizon stretched out like a scroll of parchment unrolling slowly with each measured step of the caravan animals. Here the world moved at a pace entirely its own, slower even than the rocking of ships, a rhythm set by the plodding hooves of camels and donkeys, by the crunch of sand under sandals, by the soft clink of harness bells swaying in time with weary bodies. The air itself seemed different, drier, infused with the faint spice of sun-warmed dust and the sharper temps of sweat. And though the merchant walked with steady composure, there was always the awareness that on these roads time stretched thin and wide, so that a single day might feel like three, and 3 days might fold into a single blur of movement and rest. Sunrise and sunset bleeding into one another with little distinction. Yet within this monotony there were details that offered quiet fascination. For each caravan was a world unto itself, a small society bound together by necessity, where men from many lands shared food, and stories under the pale flicker of firelight, where languages mingled like the contents of a spice sack, where disputes rose sharp and vanished quickly, worn down by the endless demands of the road. The merchant, though cautious, listened often to these voices, letting their tales fill the empty stretches of silence. And sometimes he thought that spices were not the only treasures being carried. For stories too were freight, moving from place to place, changing slightly with each retelling, becoming more valuable the farther they traveled. By day the caravan trudged across plains that seemed unchanging, marked only by the ripple of distant hills or the brief shade of a scraggly tree, while above them the sky stretched vast and pitiless, its blue dome seeming to press down upon them without end. And by night, when camp was made, the stars spread across the heavens in such profusion that it was as if the darkness itself had been pierced by countless tiny fires guiding lights as ancient as the routes they marked. And though the journey was harsh, lips cracked from dryness, skin roughened by sand, eyes stung by glare, there was also a strange serenity in its slowness, for the road demanded surrender, demanded patience, demanded that one walk at the pace of animals and wind. And in this surrender the merchant found a kind of calm, the kind that comes not from ease, but from acceptance, from yielding to the rhythm of a world far greater than oneself. So the caravan moved on, step by step, dust rising in pale clouds that caught the sunlight and lingered in the air, marking their passage like a soft veil. And within this haze, the merchant carried his thoughts, his hopes, his careful calculations of profit, but also his quiet wonder at the endlessness of the road, a wonder that lulled him, as if each step were a heartbeat. Steady and unchanging, guiding him deeper into the patient, unhurried vastness of the land. When the caravan at last halted for the evening, it did so with a sighing rhythm that mirrored the day's movement, a gradual slowing rather than a sudden. Stopped camels kneeling into the sand with groans that rose like old men easing tired joints, porters lowering their burdens with soft thuds, men stretching their backs and shaking dust from their robes. Until finally, a rough circle was formed around the heart of the camp, where fires were coaxed into being thin tongues of flame, licking at dry brush before growing steady and strong. And in this circle, the day's harshness softened. The vast expanse of desert or plain, for it varied from trip to trip, no longer something to endure but something to watch from the safety of the glow, its darkness held at bay by sparks that rose and disappeared into the starlit sky. The merchant, as always, kept himself somewhat apart, yet near enough to listen, his ledger tucked away for the night, his body resting upon a woven mat. And though his thoughts still flickered with calculations, how much weight had been lost to the journey, whether the sacks were intact, whether the animals showed signs of where that might slow them, he allowed himself to the luxury of simply watching, listening, breathing. The air at night was different, cooled and thinned, touched with the scent of smoke, of roasted grain, sometimes of dried fish or goat simmered into stew, and always faintly, the lingering spice that clung to every bag and barrel, rising more strongly now as the cooler air pressed down, making the camp smell like a market, though quieter, hushed beneath the dome of stars. Around the fires, men shared words, some in low murmurs, others in bursts of laughter, voices carrying the rise and fall of accents from lands separated by thousands of miles, and though the merchant did not always understand their words, he understood their rhythm, the cadence of human companionship, a reminder that the road was not walked alone. Sometimes songs were lifted, simple chants that moved like waves through the group, keeping time with the clapping of hands or the gentle tapping of a drum brought along for morale. And these sounds, weaving into the night air, made the desert seem less vast, less indifferent, as though it too listened and hummed along. He watched the shadows of men and beasts flicker on the sand, stretching long and then collapsing as the flames danced, and he thought of how fragile yet enduring such scenes were. Repeated countless times over centuries, a ritual, as old as trade itself, men gathered around fire, protecting one another from the cold, from the dark, from the loneliness of travel. When at last his eyes drifted upward, he saw the stars in their unnumbered brilliance, not just points of light, but rivers and clusters, guiding patterns that merchants and sailors alike had trusted for generations. And he felt a smallness that was not frightening, but strangely soothing. For if the stars had watched over so many before him, they would surely watch over him too. And in this quiet moment, surrounded by murmurs, firelight, spice scent, and the endless sky, the merchant closed his eyes not to sleep immediately, but to let the weight of the day dissolve, surrendering himself to the slow patience of the road, a patience that asked for nothing more than to rise again with the sun and continue forward one step at a time. The journey along the caravan routes was never without its trials, for while the road itself stretched wide and patient, it was also a place where the world could shift, suddenly transforming calm into hardship in the space of a single breath. And the spice merchant, though steady of spirit, never let his vigilance wane. There were the storms sudden and merciless when the wind rose from the horizon like a beast unfurling itself, hurling sand into the air, until the sky itself seemed swallowed by a red-brown haze. Grains stinging the skin like needles, mouths and eyes filled with grit, men huddling close to their camels as the animals groaned and folded into the earth while goods were covered hastily with hides and cloth. All the while the air roaring so loudly that it drowned even thought, and yet after long hours the storm would pass, leaving silence so profound that it seemed unnatural. The dunes reshaped, familiar markers gone, The world altered in its contours as if the land itself had shifted to test their resolve. There were also the endless stretches of thirst days when wells ran dry or oases proved farther than expected when lips cracked, tongues swelled. And every man thought first not of spices or profit, but of water, cool water, even a handful of it the greatest treasure one could hold. And to endure these hardships, the spice merchant carried not just provisions for his men and beasts, but stories of others who had traversed these same paths, tales of survival and endurance. And he told them around campfires, under the endless sky, reminding his companions that every thirst is ended by water, every blazing day followed by a cooler hour. Yet beyond nature's indifference, there lingered human threat, for the roots, valuable as they were never free of danger. And bands of raiders sometimes shadowed the caravan, waiting for weakness, striking swift, and vanishing again into the vastness, leaving behind broken wagons, frightened beasts, and the bitter taste of loss. And though the merchant himself was no warrior, he knew that part of his duty lay wherein preparing for such risks, ensuring guards were hired, weapons maintained, watches kept through the long nights so that trade might continue, despite the ever-present shadow of danger. Yet even in the face of such trials, there was a strange steadiness, for the caravan routes were older than fear, older than raiders, older even than memory. And those who walked them learned not to expect ease, but to trust endurance, to know that every storm ends. Every stretch of thirst is broken by water, every danger is survived or endured. And so the merchant, though cautious, moved forward always, letting each hardship settle into the rhythm of the journey, another note in the slow song of trade. For he understood that his life, like the spices he carried, was part of something vast and unbroken, something that endured not in sudden triumph, but in the patience of steps, taken one after another across the endlessness of the earth. When at last the caravan reached an oasis, the transformation was almost miraculous, for after days of endless sand and stone, where the horizon quivered with heat and hope alike, the sudden presence of water and shade seemed a vision conjured by weary minds. Yet as the merchant drew nearer, he saw the unmistakable signs that it was real. Palms rising tall, and green against the pale desert, their fronds swaying gently as though in welcome, the glimmer of water pooling at their roots, reflecting the sky in ripples of silver blue, and the low hum of voices, for such places were never empty, but always alive with travelers who had come from other directions, their caravans converging like rivers upon a basin. Here the merchant felt the first true exhale of the journey, the release of tension carried in the shoulders and jaw, as animals bent their long necks to drink deeply, their grunts of satisfaction filling the air, while men knelt beside them, scooping water into cupped hands, splashing faces, letting the coolness soak into cloths wrapped around their heads. And once thirst was quenched, the oasis became more than a place of survival. It became a market in miniature, for goods were always exchanged where men gathered. And the clearing beneath the palms soon filled with the bustle of trade. Bales of cloth spread out upon the ground, jars of oil set open to gleam in the sun, trinkets of bronze and silver displayed. While spices, too, were brought forth, sacks untied so that their perfume lifted into the warm air, mingling with the resinous smoke of fires being lit for food. The merchant, practiced in such moments, moved among the small gatherings, his hands gesturing as he spoke in low tones, his eyes sharp as he weighed offers, his nose alert for the faintest hint of quality or spoil. And though no grand deals were struck here, for these were not the great markets of cities, every exchange mattered. Every measure of spice traded for oil or cloth. Every coin tucked into the folds of his ledger's pouch, for such exchanges not only sustained the caravan, but also built ties, invisible threads of trust and familiarity that stretched from one oasis to the next. Beyond trade, there was the simple relief of rest. Men reclining in shade, their laughter louder now, their voices relaxed as bowls of lentils simmered in pots, the scent of garlic and cumin drifting through the clearing, mingling with the sharper notes of smoke and spice. And above them, the sky softened toward evening, the first stars blinking faintly even before the sun had vanished. The merchant sat quietly then, a bowl in hand, watching the flicker of firelight across weary but contented faces, and he thought of how fragile yet essential these places were. these islands of green and water, without which no trade could ever cross the vastness of the desert. And in his heart he felt gratitude, not loud but steady, a gratitude that reminded him that though his work was measured in ledgers and coin, his survival, like that of all men, was measured first in water and shade, in the mercy of an oasis that gave just enough to let the road continue. When the morning came, cool and hushed before the desert sun once more claimed its dominion, the caravan rose with it. Men stirring slowly, voices low, camels groaning as they were coaxed upright. The rhythm of departure as familiar as the rhythm of arrival. And though the oasis had offered rest and renewal, no one lingered longer than necessary, for the road itself allowed no indulgence. The merchant walked among his goods, inspecting each bundle, tightening ropes where they had loosened, running his hand across the sacks of spice as if to reassure both himself and them that all remained intact, that the journey could continue without loss. And then he paused to look back at the water shimmering now in the fresh light, the palms, rustling faintly, already seeming distant even though he still stood within their shade, and in that backward glance he felt the strange duality of the road, that every place was both anchor and fleeting, cherished yet surrendered as soon as the next step was taken. Soon the caravan stretched itself into motion, a long line against the pale sand, shadows drawn out behind them. The clinking of bells tied to the camels' necks sounding like a fragile music that marked their pace, steady and enduring, each note falling into the silence of the desert until the silence itself seemed to absorb and carry it onward. The merchant walked with them, his mind turning not to the immediate miles, but to the endless pattern of such departures. For he knew that the road was built upon these moments of leaving and arriving, of trusting that one oasis would always lead to another, that one horizon concealed the promise of the next. And as the dunes rose and fell before him, their shapes altered by yesterday's storm, yet no less timeless in their presence, he reflected that his trade, though measured in spices and coin, was also measured in patience, in the willingness to accept that nothing precious was gained without distance, without heat, without hardship, that every grain of pepper, every thread of saffron, every pod of cardamom carried with it the memory of miles endured, of thirst borne, of storms weathered, and in this truth he found a certain peace. For it reminded him that his labor was not small, but part of something vast, connecting distant lands through the most ordinary of steps, the lifting and setting down of feet upon the sand. So the caravan moved onward, the oasis dwindling behind them until it was no more than a shimmer in the air, and before them stretched only the endless horizon, both daunting and familiar, and the merchant, steady in stride, knew that the road was not his enemy, but his companion, harsh yet dependable, demanding yet faithful, always leading, always waiting, a teacher of endurance and a keeper of memory, carrying him and his spices further into the slow, unbroken journey that was his life's calling. His thoughts drifted to the bustling city from which he had set out many weeks ago, a place of echoing bazaars and sun-baked walls where the air itself hummed with the murmur of countless lives lived and stories untold. He remembered the weight of tradition on his shoulders, the legacy of his ancestors' footsteps echoing in his own as he walked the well-worn paths of his craft. The city had been his constant for years, its familiar sights and sounds a comforting embrace. But within its confines, he had sensed the stirrings of restlessness, a subtle yearning for horizons beyond the familiar skyline. Then came the call, the whispers of an opportunity too enticing to resist. A chance to trade in lands where spices were coveted and profits promised to be bountiful. With a heart full of anticipation and a touch of trepidation, he had decided to venture forth, to navigate the treacherous routes and traverse the unforgiving terrain. His caravan, a testament to resilience, pressed on through scorching heat and biting cold, enduring sandstorms and navigating treacherous paths, each mile a testament to their grit and determination. But it was in the quiet moments, under the star-studded canopy of night, that the vastness of his journey truly sunk in. Gazing at the Milky Way sprawled across the heavens, he felt a profound sense of solitude, a stark contrast to the bustling city he had left behind. Yet within this solitude, he discovered a strange solace, a communion with the ancient travelers who had traversed these very routes before him, their spirits whispering tales of hardship and resilience in the rustling wind. As days turned into weeks, the relentless rhythm of the road seeped into his bones, becoming the very essence of his existence. The rise and grind of the caravan, the creaking of camel bells, the murmur of his fellow travelers, these became the soundtrack of his life. In the shared hardships and quiet companionship, bonds were forged that transcended the usual confines of his social standing. And now, as he stood on the edge of another horizon, he realized that the road had become more than just a path to distant markets. It had become a crucible, testing his limits and refining his spirit. The endless dunes before him were no longer just a challenge to overcome, but a reflection of his own inner strength. Each grain of sand a testament to his journey, a reminder of the miles devoured by the relentless march of time, straightened his shoulders, a newfound resolve hardening his gaze. The road may be long and unforgiving, but he was its master. With each step, he was etching his story into the very fabric of the desert, proving that even amidst the harshest landscapes, the human spirit, much like the resilient caravan, could not only endure, but thrive. The first sight of the city always came gradually, not as a sudden revelation, but as a slow weaving of details that whispered of its nearness. Long before its walls rose fully against the sky, and the spice merchant, seasoned though he was, felt the same subtle stirring of anticipation each time, for the air itself seemed to change as they drew nearer, a faint greenness replacing the stark dryness of the open desert. The ground firmer beneath the camel's padded feet, scattered dwellings appearing like scattered stones upon the earth.
Ow.
Each one a sign that the great center of life lay close. Then came the first figures of children running at a distance, curious eyes following the caravan. Then women at wells, their laughter rising as they lifted jars with practiced grace. And finally, the noise of traffic upon the outer roads, carts creaking, donkeys braying, the calls of men driving their animals toward the gates. The merchant felt these small preludes as part of the rhythm of his trade. For every city, no matter how distant, introduced itself through its outskirts, before revealing its heart. And when at last the walls appeared tall and sun-warmed their gates, flung wide to admit the endless flow of traffic, his pulse quickened slightly, not with impatience, but with the recognition that here at last the slow miles of the road gave way to the fast pulse of exchange. Inside, the city unfolded like a tapestry rich with color and sound. Narrow streets wound between stalls draped in cloth of vivid dyes, the scent of roasting meat curling in the air. Mingling with the sharper fragrance of garlic and onion, the sweetness of dates and honey sold in clay jars, the earthy musk of leather hides stacked in piles, and everywhere voices rising and falling, haggling, laughing, calling out wares, while above it all, towers of temples and palaces gleamed. A reminder that trade was not only the lifeblood of common men, but also the wealth that adorned rulers. The merchant guided his caravan carefully through this living maze, his camels swaying under their loads, the bells upon their necks jingling faintly, their presence drawing stares from children and knowing glances from rival traders. For the scent of his cargo betrayed him even before he unpacked it, the warm pepper, sharp yet alluring, the saffron. Golden and subtle, the cinnamon, rich and sweet, all announcing themselves in invisible trails that made heads turn as if pulled by unseen cords. He found his place in the market's appointed square, space marked for spice dealers. For every trade in these cities had its district, its rightful corner of the great mosaic, and there he set down his goods. Cloth spread sacks opened, the colors of his trade revealed to the sun. Black pepper like tiny beads of night, saffron threads glowing as though spun from dawn itself, cinnamon curled into dark brown scrolls, nutmeg polished and fragrant. Each one more than food, more than flavor, each one a luxury, a treasure, a story carried across miles. And as he prepared to trade, he felt again the curious balance that defined his life. The road, long and silent, replaced here by noise and clamor, by hands grasping, eyes appraising, voices bargaining, and though it was exhausting in its own way, he welcomed it. For this was the reason for all endurance. The moment when the hidden labor of the desert became visible wealth in the eyes of others. When the long silence of travel burst into the chorus of exchange, In that noise, in that scent, in that color, the merchant knew himself again as a small but vital thread in the vast weaving of human trade. The art of bargaining was never a matter of mere numbers, for though coins changed hands and scales, tipped beneath measured weights, the heart of every exchange lay in the slow dance of voices, gestures, and the subtle recognition of pride. And the spice merchant, long practiced in this art, knew that every culture brought its own rhythm to the market, its own unspoken rules that could not be ignored. When he dealt with Roman buyers, for instance, he encountered a directness that sometimes bordered on impatience. Their senators and wealthy matrons sending stewards to demand cinnamon or saffron with an air of entitlement, as though the value of their coin outweighed all other considerations. Yet even then there were nuances, for Roman pride could be soothed by flattery, by a respectful acknowledgement of their power. And so the merchant learned to nod gravely, to speak of their discernment in choosing the finest goods, till their sharp edges softened, and they haggled, not with anger, but with the satisfaction of having been properly recognized. With Persian traders, however, the dance was different, more like a weaving of silken threads, each phrase careful and ornamental, for Persians admired not only the goods themselves, but the elegance of the exchange. And so he adopted their manner, speaking in metaphors, likening saffron to strands of captured sunlight, pepper 2 stars fallen from the night sky, offering his words as much as his wares, until the bargain once concluded felt less like commerce and more like poetry woven into agreement. And then there were the Indian merchants, sharp and methodical, whose knowledge of spice was as deep as his own, and with them the haggling could last for hours, each side pressing, retreating, advancing again. The debate not merely about price, but about knowledge, for they would test him, ask of origins, of harvests, the soil where the pepper vines had climbed, of the moisture in which nutmeg had been dried, and only when he answered with confidence did they allow the conversation to turn toward numbers. And even then it was never hurried, for patience itself was a coin in those exchanges. Through all these encounters, the merchant understood that bargaining was not simply the means by which profit was secured, but the means by which respect was earned. For no man trusted a trader who yielded too quickly, nor one who pressed too hard. And so he carried himself with a calm firmness, allowing silence to speak as much as words, letting the buyer feel the weight of pause, the significance of consideration. But beyond the give and take of the individual sale, he saw the grander patterns of trade, how Roman matrons, their hands heavy, which rings would gather to examine bales of silk from China, their fingers tracing patterns that spoke of distant lands. How Persian scholars, seated in shaded corners of the market, debated the merits of various poivrids while sipping sherbet, their talk a mix of poetry and wit. How Indian craftsmen displayed their wares with an air of calm intensity, their carved ivory figurines seeming to hold the secrets of time itself, their knowledge of the market as sure and steady as the sunrise. And always there was the fragrance, the secret heartbeat of the market, a symphony of scents carried on the wind. Cinnamon and cardamom mingling with the salt temps of sea spray, the earthy aroma of freshly tilled soil, the heady perfume of night jasmine, all creating an atmosphere as rich and layered as the silks and spices themselves. Then, as the sun climbed higher, the energy of the market reached its zenith. Vendors called out praises to their wares. The air buzzed with the murmur of countless conversations, each a potential deal waiting to be struck. Porters expertly balanced precariously laden carts, their movements a testament to years of practice. And amid it all, the spice merchant stood, a figure of quiet resilience, his knowledge and composure a constant in the midst of the shifting tides of commerce. For him, the market was more than just a place of trade. It was a living tapestry, celebration of the world's bounty and the intricate web of human connection. It was a place where the most disparate cultures came together, where the finest goods from the farthest reaches of the known world were brought to meet the keen eyes and discerning palates of eager buyers. And at the center of this vibrant tableau, the spice merchant played his part, a humble purveyor of exotic treasures. His weathered face a map of the journeys he had taken, his eyes reflecting the wisdom gleaned from countless transactions. He understood that the true art of bargaining lay not just in securing the best price, but in building bridges of understanding, in recognizing the unspoken codes and customs of the myriad cultures that converged upon this bustling marketplace. And as the day wore on, the sun beating down upon the vibrant scene, the spice merchant felt not just the pulse of commerce, but the thrum of human connection, the quiet satisfaction of a life fully lived. A testament to the enduring power of trade and the quiet dignity of a life well traded. The market was more than the clatter of coins and the fragrance of goods. It was a library without walls. A place where stories traveled faster than caravans and knowledge was bartered as eagerly as saffron or silk. And the spice merchant, while careful in his trade, was also a listener. His ears were always attuned to the flow of voices that carried news from distant horizons. For in the shifting world of commerce, information was a treasure equal to any spice. Beneath the shade of awnings, he heard rumors of Roman legions marching eastward, of emperors fretting over revolts in provinces he would never see. And though such matters might seem far removed from his sacks of pepper, he knew that the unrest of armies often meant disrupted roads, and disrupted roads meant danger for caravans like his. From Persian scribes, their fingers stained with ink, he learned of new canals being dug, of taxes raised on foreign goods, of treaties signed in smoky halls. And these whispers told him whether his cargo would fetch a higher price in Babylon, or whether patience might bring greater reward in Persepolis. And from Indian traders seated cross-legged upon their woven mats, he gathered not only trade news, but knowledge of plants themselves. For they spoke freely of harvests of monsoons that had fallen early or late, of regions where pepper vines had thrived or faltered. And he, in turn, offered his own observations of markets westward, building a web of shared knowledge that stretched across deserts and seas. The market was also alive with stories that belonged less to commerce and more to the deep hunger of human curiosity. Sailors told of islands where nutmeg grew in forests so dense that the air itself was spiced. Scholars debated the nature of stars as if their very courses determined the price of cloves. Priests recounted myths that wrapped the gods themselves in the perfumes of cinnamon. And though not every tale was true, every tale was worth hearing, for within exaggeration often lay a seed of reality, and within myth often a glimpse of the values by which men lived. In the quiet of the evening, when the stalls were being packed away and the crowd thinned out, the merchant would linger, listening to the conversations around him. Sometimes he sat upon a nearby stone, watching the sky blaze with the colors of sunset. At other times, he sought the shade of a wall, its cool touch a welcome relief against the day's heat. But wherever he found himself, he would listen. He heard the gruff voice of the sailor, his skin leathery as old rope, talking of storms encountered and of star-dusted nights. When the sea was a black mirror to the heavens, he listened to the scholar, his robes rustling like autumn leaves, discussing the changing patterns of the winds, how they veered and shifted, why they carried not only ships but also seeds and rumors to distant shores. He sat quietly as the priest spoke of ancient beliefs, how celestial bodies influence not just the tides, but the growth of spices, how the very essence of the heavens flavored the earth below. And as the night deepened and the sounds of the city faded into the distance, the merchant felt a strange kinship with these men, so different from him, yet bound to him by the invisible threads of human experience. He, too, had journeyed across vast stretches of water. He, too, had navigated by the stars. And though he dealt in earthly spices, he, too, sensed the influence of the heavens upon his life. Then, when the time was right, he would rise, shouldering his pack once more. As he walked away from the market, the fading sounds of the city mingling with the murmur of the night wind, he carried with him more than merchandise. He took with him the tales of distant lands, the whispers of knowledge, the echoes of human experience. For the merchant, though he claimed no title beyond his humble trade, understood that in carrying his sacks of spice, he also carried stories. He carried fragments of knowledge. He carried the invisible threads that wove the world into something whole. The marketplace was, in truth, a stage upon which every class of society played its part. And the spice merchant, though concerned chiefly with his own trade, could not help but observe the vast contrasts that unfolded before his eyes. For here emperor's wealth brushed shoulders with beggar's desperation, and the scent of saffron, rare and golden, drifted over both without distinction. In one corner of the market, beneath canopies stretched high and trimmed with embroidered silk, the wealthy elite paraded with an air of indulgence, their garments heavy with dyes and jewels, their servants carrying baskets already filled with figs, wine, and ivory, yet still they paused before his stall, their noses lifting, their fingers pointing at the cinnamon scrolls or the delicate red threads of saffron, demanding the rarest spices not for sustenance but for luxury, for feasts that would impress guests, for perfumes that would cling to their robes, for offerings at altars where gods themselves were expected to notice the fragrance. Nearby, merchants of middling rank approached more cautiously, men whose fortunes rested not on empire, but on steady trade, whose hands bore the calluses of labor and whose purses held fewer coins. Yet they too sought his wares, perhaps not the most extravagant, but pepper by the measure, a handful of cloves, a pinch of nutmeg. For such purchases, though modest, lent their households a touch of wealth, a signal that they too could partake in the luxuries that kings once claimed alone. And beyond these came the humbler buyers, cooks sent by inns their aprons, still stained from hearth and smoke, bargaining hard for pepper that would stretch. Across many meals, not to dazzle, but to flavor the bread and stews of ordinary men. And still further at the edges lingered the beggars and the poor, their eyes wide, their bellies thin, who could not dream of buying, but who stood close enough to inhale the drifting scent of cinnamon and pepper, as if that invisible abundance could, for a moment, lift them beyond their hunger. Entertainers moved among them all, jugglers tossing knives, musicians plucking strings, their presence a reminder that even in the weightiest exchanges, laughter and song found their place. While priests passed through as well, gathering spices for incense, their faces solemn as they reminded the merchant that his trade served not only men but gods. In this mingling of classes, the merchant saw reflected the strange democracy of spice, for though it was costly and rare, its fragrance was inescapable, touching every nose that walked the market, rich or poor, and in that fragrance lay its power, its ability to bind together worlds and classes. To draw a Roman matron and a desert beggar into the same breath, if only for a fleeting instant. And as he watched these figures come and go, the merchant thought not of coin alone, but of how the goods he carried wove themselves into the fabric of daily life at every level, from the marble halls of emperors to the humblest kitchens, shaping taste, ritual, and desire in ways no ruler could command, reminding him once more that his labor, patient and unremarkable on the road, blossomed here into something that touched the very heart of human existence. By evening, the marketplace, which only hours before had roared with voices, shimmered with colors and swelled with the perfume of spice, began to transform. It unraveled itself as though it had never been. The merchant, who had watched it bloom at dawn, now watched it fade with equal attention, for in that vanishing he found as much meaning as in its bustle. The awnings were taken down first, their bright cloths folded and tucked into carts, the poles stacked in neat bundles, leaving the sky once more wide and unshaded, the sun now slanting low and gilding the emptying square in tones of amber. Then the stalls themselves were cleared. Jars stoppered, sacks tied, baskets lifted, and what had been abundance an hour before became absence. The smells lingering, but the goods gone, locked away behind shutters, or carried off by owners who vanished into the city's narrow streets. At first, the voices remained, laughter and haggling, the rhythmic calls of the vendors, the murmur of bartering, but these too began to soften, to trail off, giving way to muted exchanges as fathers called for their children. Lovers met for trysts, and neighbors exchanged news as they passed. And then even these were lost to distance as the crowds thinned, leaving behind only a scatter of children kicking dust, a dog sniffing after scraps, a beggar curling into the shelter of a doorway. And in that stillness, the merchant felt again the strange illusion of markets, that they were at once permanent and fleeting, timeless in their existence, yet vanishing in their daily form like waves that rose each morning, only to break and dissolve by nightfall. He remained seated for a time, his sacks of spice now closed, and bound his ledger marked with the day's figures, watching the shadows lengthen, listening as the first lamps were lit in windows, and the distant hum of evening prayers rose above the rooftops. For a long while he was alone, or rather, he was surrounded by the ghosts of the day, the spectral forms of those who had come before. And in their fading echoes, he saw the life of the marketplace writ large, a panorama of humanity that shifted with the sun. He saw the Roman steward, his face creased with distaste, before finally conceding to a price. He saw the Persian scholar, his fingers drumming on the scales as he weighed out pepper, speaking in hushed tones of stars and constellations. He saw the child who had stopped by out of curiosity, his eyes widening at the sight of the curling sticks of cinnamon, though he knew he would never taste them. These fragments, though small, became part of the merchant's own journey, memories tucked away as surely as the coins he now carried in his pouch. And as the market emptied into silence, he understood that its power lay not only in commerce, but in its ephemerality, in its capacity to remind all who entered that wealth, desire, laughter, and bargaining like the stalls themselves were as fleeting as the sun, yet always certain to return. So when he rose at last, gathering his goods, and preparing to return to the lodging house where he would rest until dawn, he felt neither regret nor weariness, but a calm acceptance, knowing that tomorrow the market would rise again like a bloom upon the city's heart, and he would once more spread his cloth, open his sacks, and join the endless rhythm of appearance and disappearance, of sound and silence, of trade and memory, that made the marketplace not merely a place of buying and selling, but a living, breathing reflection of life itself. The sea revealed itself long before the merchant reached the harbor, for its presence was felt first in the air. In the subtle shift of wind that carried salt instead of dust, coolness instead of dry heat, and then in the cry of gulls wheeling overhead, their sharp voices unlike any desert bird, until at last the horizon itself gleamed with water, endless and shimmering, a mirror of the sky broken by the silhouettes of sails. To the spice merchant, who had spent months upon the road, the sight was both wonder and unease, for the sea was not like the desert, which, though harsh, was steady, predictable in its silence. The sea was alive, restless, shifting even as one looked upon it. And though ships promised speed and profit, they also carried 1,000 dangers. He had heard tales of storms that swallowed ships whole, of reefs that tore through holes, of pirates and of sickness. All these unseen beneath their waves, yet trade demanded courage. And so he walked the docks with practiced calm, his eyes sweeping across the forest of masts, the rigging taut and creaking in the wind, the smell of pitch and tar mingling with that of fish and salt, sailors shouting as they hauled ropes, their voices coarse but rhythmic, like chants that bound chaos into order. He saw men wrestling barrels up gangplanks, others securing bales of cloth with coil upon coil of rope. A fight broke out over a spilled cask of ale. A woman with skin like mahogany and hair like woven gold stood bargaining with a gruff-looking man while a small boy scrambled about the deck of a ship, deftly avoiding the cleats and ropes. Masts rose like giants from the wooden decks, their shadows stretching out, fingers pointing towards the sullen sky. Colorful sails hung like tattered clothes on lines stretched between the tops of the masts, flapping gently in the breeze. And then he saw his ship, the Jade Dragon, a sturdy vessel with a hull as dark as a raven's wing. It was a ship built for cargo, not for speed or the whims of the nobles, and it had seen better days, but it was strong and true, its decks worn smooth by countless voyages. His own ship, the Jade Dragon, was there before him, its sails patched and layered like a veteran's cloak, its masts sturdy against the skyline. As he oversaw the loading of his sacks of cinnamon, ginger, and pepper, he felt a shift within himself, as though one life, that of sand and caravan, was ending, and another, that of water and wind, was beginning. The camels, his faithful carriers of spice, were gone now, replaced by sailors who lifted the goods with broad backs and laughter, joking even as they heaved heavy bundles below deck. Their ease, born of familiarity with the rhythms of the sea, was both comforting and unnerving to one who had not yet learned to trust the moods of the sea. At last, the ship pulled away from the dock. Ropes cast off, oars dipped briefly, and the wind filled the sails. The merchant, with his heady mix of apprehension and excitement, stood at the rail, watching the land shrink into a hazy line. The desert, the markets, the oases, all vanishing behind him. And before him, only the heaving expanse, blue and endless, rolling in slow swells that carried him farther from certainty with every breath. He felt the deck shift beneath his feet, a motion both gentle and unsettling. And though he steadied himself quickly, he knew that on this journey balance would be demanded not only of body but of spirit. For on the sea, storms could rise without warning. Pirates could appear from the horizon. Sickness could spread among the crew. And no oasis, no well, no friendly market lay between, only water, deep and indifferent, stretching on without mercy. Yet he also knew that the sea, for all its peril, was the thread that bound continents together, that without it, his spices would remain confined to deserts and cities, never reaching the palaces of Rome, the courts of Persia, or the temples of India. And so he watched the sails billow and the waves break against the hull with a steady gaze, accepting that here upon the restless water he entered the second half of his calling, the half that required not endurance of sand, but endurance of storm, not patience of steps, but patience of tides, a test as ancient and necessary as the desert road itself. Life aboard the ship soon revealed its own rhythm, one that differed entirely from the measured pace of caravans, yet carried a similar sense of endurance. For each day unfolded according to the moods of wind and water, and the spice merchant, though a passenger, found himself drawn into the order of the crew, observing with care the endless tasks that kept the vessel alive. The sailors rose with the sun, their bodies lean and hardened by years of salt and roped their laughter, carrying easily over the crash of waves as they tightened, rigging adjusted sails, scrubbed decks until the planks gleamed, their movements practiced and unthinking, as if the sea itself had shaped them into extensions of its will. He watched as they climbed the masts with bare feet gripping rope-like hands, their silhouettes framed against the sky, calling down to one another in short bursts of words that sounded almost like song. And he marveled at how these men, rough in appearance, carried a grace that belonged to those who trusted not land but water, who balanced without thought upon planks that tilted and rolled beneath them. Meals were simple but shared with a kind of camaraderie he had rarely seen in markets. Bowls of salted fish, bread toughened by sea air, dried fruits softened with water, all passed around with rough jokes and quick laughter, the merchant included, though he was no sailor. His presence accepted as part of the ship's temporary family, for here rank mattered less than trust. And trust was earned through patience, silence, and a willingness to share hardship. At night, when the sails caught the moonlight and the sea itself glowed faintly with the shimmer of unseen creatures, he lay awake on the deck, listening to the creak of wood, the sigh of wind, the occasional snore of a sailor stretched nearby. And in those hours he felt both more alone and more connected than ever before, for the sea surrounded him on all sides, vast and unbroken, yet above him the stars returned. Steady and familiar, the same stars that had guided his caravan across deserts, now mirrored in the black water below. Still beneath this rhythm of labor and quiet, there pulsed the constant awareness of danger. For the sea demanded vigilance, and he could see it in the way the captain's eyes scanned the horizon, in the way sailors tightened ropes again and again, even when they seemed secure, in the way every man stiffened at the sudden shift of wind or the cry of a lookout, knowing that calm was never guaranteed, that the sea's gift of movement could turn without warning into a curse of fury. And so the merchant, though spared the labor of hauling and climbing, kept his own kind of watch, his mind balancing the value of his cargo against the risks of the journey, his heart steadying itself against the reminder that though coins and spices filled his thoughts, hereupon the water survival itself was the truest measure of wealth. The storm announced itself not with thunder but with silence, a sudden stilling of the sea that unsettled even the most seasoned sailor. And the spice merchant, though no expert in such matters, sensed it as clearly as they did. For the ship that had rocked gently with the rhythm of the waves now seemed to hang suspended, its sails sagging in air that grew heavy, oppressive, as though the world itself held its breath. Then, without warning, the first gust came, sharp and cold, snapping the sails and rattling the ropes, followed by another stronger still until the sky darkened with a speed that seemed unnatural. Clouds gathering in towering shapes that swallowed both horizon and light, leaving only a narrow band of pale green along the edge of the sea. The crew erupted into motion, their calm efficiency of daily life transformed into urgency. Voices raised in commands, boots slamming against the wet planks as they hauled at ropes, reefed sails, lashed barrels. Their movements swift yet controlled, each man trusting the other with his life. Rain came then first in drops the size of coins, then in sheets. So thick it blurred sight to a few feet, drenching the merchant, where he clung to the rail, salt and water mingling as the ship heaved. Beneath him, its timbers groaning like a beast in pain. Lightning split the sky in jagged lines, illuminating for a heartbeat the waves that now rose like mountains. Walls of water that surged against the hull with a roar that drowned all speech. And in those flashes, the merchant saw faces twisted in effort, hands raw upon ropes, and eyes that betrayed fear even as they worked. He held fast, his knuckles white, his body thrown side to side with every pitch of the deck. And though he told himself that this was but another trial of trade, another toll demanded by the road, or in this case the sea, a deeper voice within him whispered that no bargain could ever be struck with the waters. That here, unlike in markets or courts, wealth, wit, or rank meant nothing, that the sea was master, and all men were only tolerated guests upon its surface. Hours passed in a blur of noise and motion, each wave threatening to be the one that would break them. Yet the ship endured. Held by the stubborn labor of men who refused to surrender, their voices now hoarse, their muscles trembling, but their will unbroken. At last, as suddenly as it had begun, the fury lessened, the waves still high, but no longer towering. The wind still fierce, but no longer shrieking, and though the rain continued, it fell now with a steadiness that felt almost merciful. The merchant, soaked, shaken but alive, dared to lift his eyes, to breathe, to unclench his grip. Upon the rail, and in that moment of fragile calm, he realized how small he was. How small all men were against the immensity of water and sky, and he understood why sailors spoke of the sea, not merely as a place, but as a being unpredictable, demanding, sometimes generous, but never tame. And as if to underscore that lesson, the sky split open once more, revealing a glimpse of sun, weak and watery, yet enough to send a rainbow arcing across the waves. A fragile, fleeting beauty in the midst of all that power. The merchant looked away, unable to meet that gaze directly, and saw instead the busy industry of the crew, their movements now slower, their faces grim, their shoulders slumped with fatigue, yet with purpose. They were making ready for the aftermath, for the long, slow task of getting the ship and themselves upright again. There was work to be done, the captain said, his voice hoarse but resolute. The storm has passed, he said, and we have survived, but the sea is still our mistress. So get up now, make ready. We sail again when the light returns. And as the crew dispersed to their tasks, the merchant stood a moment longer, letting the wind blow back his hair, letting the rain wash over his face, feeling the spray of the waves upon his skin. And in that wild bath of elemental force, he knew that he had been marked by the sea, bearing upon him the salt and the storm as tokens of his own mortality, as reminders of the day the tempest tried him, and the sea whispered, "This is my power, this is my will. Let him who stays too long upon my surface learn what I am." In the days after the storm, when the sea had calmed once more, and the sails swelled gently under steady winds, the merchant noticed that the mood aboard the ship did not return fully to ease. For though laughter returned in bursts, and men sang again at their work, there lingered a wariness in their eyes. A habit of scanning the horizon that seemed less about weather and more about what other ships might appear. It was then that he learned from whispered tales half spoken over salted fish at supper that the seas he now crossed were as well known for pirates as for storms, and that these raiders, swift and merciless, struck not only from distant coasts, but sometimes from among the very traders of rival cities. Men who knew the value of spice, silk, and coin as keenly as he did, but who preferred the blade and the hook to bargaining or barter. The sailors told stories of sleek vessels, painted black oars moving in perfect rhythm, closing the distance before a merchant ship could flee, and of grappling hooks biting into wood-drawing vessels, together until steel clashed and cries rang out across the water. The merchant listened, his hand unconsciously tightening on the pouch at his belt, though he knew well enough that in such an event no personal fortune could save him. For pirates took not only goods, but sometimes lives, casting aside all pretense of fairness. He watched more carefully then, noticing the way the lookout at the mast's peak never rested his gaze. How the captain often paced the deck with narrowed eyes, how the crew, though relaxed in their duties, kept weapons near at hand. Short swords, axes, even heavy poles tipped with iron meant to push back boarders. Each morning brought with it a renewed sweep of the horizon. Each distant speck upon the water examined with suspicion, until it proved to be nothing more than a fishing boat or another trader bound for some coastal port. And yet the unease seeped into the merchant's dreams, so that even when he lay beneath, stars he imagined, shadows gliding across the waves. Imagine the sudden cry of alarm, the rush of feet, the clash of steel, and he woke with his heart pounding as if the fight had already come. But he was also struck by the strange paradox that even this danger was part of the CS rhythm. That the possibility of ambush or attack was as natural here as the bargaining of markets was on land. And he reflected that in truth, pirates were not so different from traders. They, too, sought gain, only by different means. And though he despised their violence, he could not deny the shadow they cast over his own trade for their threat. Raise the price of spices, their danger shaped the routes of ships, and in some twisted way, they were part of the same system that had carried him this far. So he, like the sailors, began to scan the horizon with wary eyes. Not because he could change what might come, but because the act itself gave comfort, as though vigilance alone could hold danger at bay. And each night when no black ship had appeared, he gave thanks quietly, not only for safety, but for the reminder that in this wide and uncertain world, every cargo has carried within it not only the weight of goods, but the invisible burden of risk. A risk that bound sailors, merchants, and even pirates together in the unending story of the sea. At last, after weeks upon the water that seemed at times endless, the sea itself relented and revealed to them the sight every sailor and merchant longed for. The faint line of land upon the horizon, growing slowly from a smudge of shadow to the distinct outline of cliffs and hills, then to the gleam of walls and towers catching the morning sun, and finally to the bustling port that lay at its heart. The crew, who had endured storms and sleepless watches with hardened silence, now broke into grins and shouts, their voices carrying over the water as they pointed toward familiar landmarks, each man eager to plant his feet upon unmoving earth once more. The merchant, too, felt a rush of relief, though his was tempered by reflection, for he knew that this port, though promising rest, also meant the reckoning of accounts, of cargo weighed and valued, of profits tallied against risks endured. As they drew nearer, the sense of land reached them, first earthy and green, a balm after the unchanging brine of the sea, followed by the sharper temps of smoke rising from cooking fires, the sweet spice of markets, it's already awake, and the faint but unmistakable musk of animals penned near shore. The harbor itself was alive with motion. Ships of every size jostling for space, sails furled and unfurled, flags snapping in the wind. The cries of dock workers echoing against stone quays, where crates, barrels, and bundles passed from hand to hand in a ceaseless rhythm of trade. He stood at the rail, watching with calm intensity as their ship glided into this organized chaos, guided by practiced hands that threw ropes and secured moorings with the same certainty that had kept them alive upon the open water. And when the gangplank was lowered at last, he followed the line of sailors onto the solid boards connecting their ship to the dock, the ground. Swaying beneath his feet, though, it was still his body, still remembering the motion of waves. Around him surged the life of port, traders shouting prices, carts rattling over stone porters, bent beneath loads, children darting through the crowd, dogs barking at one another. And he felt for a moment as though he had stepped from one world into another, the quiet majesty of sea and sky replaced by the noisy, tangible press of human ambition. Yet he carried with him something that noise could not erase. The memory of the storm's fury, the sight of lightning across black waves, the tension of waiting for pirates that never came, and he knew that though his cargo of spices would soon be measured, weighed and converted into coin, its true worth was not in numbers, but in the survival that had delivered it here. In the endurance of men who had fought wind and wave, in the fragile thread that bound his journey together. He adjusted the heavy cloth sack at his side, a gesture automatic after weeks at sea when every movement had to be considered. He had carried that sack along with the hopes and needs of his family, of his city, of his life, across the face of danger. It had been lashed to the deck, buffeted by wind, rocked by waves, threatened by storms. Its weight had shifted, sometimes settling to one corner, sometimes pressing against him as he leaned against it for a moment's rest. But it had endured just as he had, and now that endurance was beginning to pay its dividends. He passed a weathered hand over his eyes, letting the motion of the crowd, the cries of the porters, the shouts of vendors, wash over him like the familiar sound of waves on a welcoming shore. This, too, was part of the reckoning, a test not of numbers, but of endurance. A measure of what it cost to bring these spices from distant shores to this teeming port. It was a cost that went beyond gold, beyond the safety of sheltered harbors, beyond even the skill of navigating stars and winds. It was a cost written in the lines on a weathered face, in the calluses that had grown on his palms, in the dreams of home that had sustained him through dark nights. And as he followed his goods toward the warehouses where negotiations awaited, he lifted his gaze once more to the horizon, to the endless line where sea met sky, and he gave a silent acknowledgement to the waters that had spared him, to the dangers that had tested him, and to the unseen rhythm that governed all journeys. Whether by land or by sea, a rhythm that reminded him always that wealth was fleeting, trade uncertain, but the experience itself, the passage through storm and calm alike, was the true treasure carried within him. The city rose before the spice merchant like a vision, its walls gleaming in the light of dawn, towers stabbing upward as though to rival the sky itself, gates yawning open to streams of people that poured in and out, with the ceaseless motion of a tide, and he weary from the sea. Yet sharpened by the trials he had endured, felt both awe and caution as he entered. For within that teeming populace were perils as well as patrons, cut purses seeking nimble fingers and unseeing eyes, overseers eager to snuff out unlicensed trades, soldiers looking for reasons to test their swords on some foreigner's back. And the spice merchant, for all his weariness, was ready for them. The streets were alive with clamor unlike anything he had known on deck or desert, for here humanity pressed close on all sides. Merchants crying their wares in voices polished by years of persuasion, beggars tugging at sleeves with pleas rehearsed as skillfully as any sales pitch, children weaving between legs with laughter and mischief, their hands quick to slip into the purses of the careless. He had expected all these, had bargained against them, prepared to weather them as one braces for the gales that snatch at a ship's sails. Each sound a note in the symphony of the city, which rose above the din, composing a harmony all its own. He passed beneath awnings of vivid cloth that fluttered overhead, shading stalls laden with goods of dizzying variety, silks dyed in hues. He had never seen in his homeland glass that sparkled like captured stars coins from kingdoms, whose names were barely whispers in his memory. Fruits, piled high in pyramids of color, their fragrance so thick in the air that it mingled with the heavier perfume of spices, both familiar and strange. Here were the products of voyages as perilous as his own across the churning sea or through sun-bleached, desserts brought by men who had braved sandstorms, pirates, and the endless ache of longing for home, all to deliver these marvels to this place where marvels were expected. And as he walked, the sound shifted, not in volume, for here there were no lulls, no respites, only variations, like the subtle change in a wave's crest as it crashes on the shore, ever present, ever changing. The cries of vendors were countered by the sharp bark of overseers, the lilting calls of musicians at corners, plucking strings or blowing pipes, their melodies weaving into the cacophony of voices. Above it all rose the scent of incense, carried from temples where worshippers knelt before gods whose names he did not know, but whose presence was palpable in the devotion of those who lit candles and offered prayers. There were moments when the crowd ebbed, allowing glimpses down narrow lanes where shadows lay undisturbed, or across courtyards where fountains sang in silver threads of water. But even in those brief pauses, the city held its breath, gathering itself for the next surge, the next call, the next piece of music swelling from a street corner, mingling with the murmur of prayers from a distant courtyard, blending with the sharp notes of a vendor's call. And ever through it all, the spice merchant walked feeling the weight of his cargo, more keenly than ever, for here in this center of splendor spices would not merely be measured in sacks, but displayed in bowls of carved wood. Sold in shops, adorned with polished brass carried to palaces, where nobles and rulers would pay in gold for what had begun as a faint aroma carried on desert wind or sea breeze. But even as the heat of bodies closed around him, even as the clamor threatened to swallow him, he felt a different stirring within, beyond profit, beyond even survival. A recognition that this city, with its crowded streets and soaring temples, was a mirror of all trade, all journeying, all endurance. For here in this crucible of commerce, every coin exchanged, every crate unloaded, every word shouted in the market was part of the same great weaving of lives and desires that had brought him here. And so though the noise pressed heavy on his ears, he walked on with steady steps, knowing that to enter the city was not merely to sell, but to take part in a performance greater than himself, a performance written not in ink or ledgers, but in the endless chorus of human striving, where spice was only one note in a symphony of splendor. The spice market lay at the city's heart like a jewel, its narrow lanes choked with awnings that draped the stalls in stripes of crimson. Saffron and indigo, the very colors of the goods within. And as the merchant stepped into its press of bodies, he was struck first by the air itself, for it was so thick with fragrance that it seemed to cling to his skin, a mingling of cinnamon, clove, pepper, ginger, nutmeg, and countless others, each vying to dominate the senses, yet blending into a perfume so intoxicating that one could almost taste wealth with every breath. He passed stalls piled high with mounds of golden turmeric baskets overflowing with peppercorns as dark as polished, stone jars filled with saffron threads so fine they looked like fire caught in glass, and powders ground into hues that rivaled the dyes of cloth sellers, vivid reds, deep ochres, and soft greens laid out like pigments upon a painter's palette. On every side, vendors shouted their claims in rhythmic cadences, boasting of purity, rarity, or the secrets of faraway lands their words. Rising above the din of bargaining and buyers, leaned close fingers, testing textures' noses, bent low over bowls to catch the subtle differences that only the practiced could detect. In one corner, a dealer unfurled scrolls that listed the routes by which his spices had come, as though to sell not only the goods but the very story of their travels while across the lane. Another tempted customers with taste, offering a sprinkle of powder upon bread, so that flavor itself sealed the bargain. The merchant paused often, watching these tactics with the calm eyes of one who had traveled the paths himself, who knew the sweat of caravans and the peril of seas behind each glittering pile. And though he respected the theater of selling, he also knew that much of it was illusion, for what mattered most was not the loudest cry, but the most reliable hand, the reputation built over years of fair measure and consistent quality. Still, he could not deny the allure of the place, where every color, scent, and sound seemed designed to overwhelm, to remind all who entered that here lay the true arteries of the city, carrying not only goods, but also ideas, fashions, and ambitions. For those who purchased spices did not merely flavor their food, but declared their status, their refinement, their place within the ever-rising hierarchy of wealth. He thought then of how far each grain had traveled, pepper from jungles where rains fell without end, cinnamon stripped from bark in distant islands, saffron plucked thread by thread from fragile flowers, and he marveled that these tiny fragments of earth could command such power. Here could stir nobles and merchants alike to part with gold and silver, as though compelled by desire itself. Yet amidst the spectacle, he also felt the undercurrent of rivalry, the sharp glances cast from one stall to another, the subtle gestures by which men warned away customers, the whispers of accusations of adulteration or deceit, and he realized that though the market dazzled with its brilliance, beneath it beat the same heart he had known in every port and caravanserai, the heart of competition, relentless and unyielding, where profit was survival and reputation was lifeblood. And so he tightened his grip upon his own sacks, ready to stake his place in this theater of splendor, knowing that his journey across deserts and seas had led not to an end, but to this stage, where the true value of his endurance would be tested not by storms or swords, but by words, gestures, and the fine balance between trust and suspicion that defined the spice trade. When at last the spice merchant opened his own stall, spreading a length of cloth upon the worn planks and arranging his sacks with deliberate care, He felt the eyes of the market shift toward him, some curious, some wary, for in a place where every hand sought advantage, the arrival of a new competitor was never ignored. Across the lane, the rival merchants shifted restlessly, their faces a mixture of disdain and distrust. But the spice merchant had toiled for years to reach this moment, and he would not be deterred. He began not with shouts, but with quiet order, loosening the ties of his sacks, so that their aromas drifted into the air, letting the fragrance speak before his own tongue did. The spices themselves were his credentials, each grain and powder a testament to his journey. As the morning deepened, passers-by slowed, drawn by the subtle sharpness of pepper, the warm sweetness of cinnamon, the bright sting of ginger. The first to approach were servants, their arms already heavy with other purchases, their eyes calculating as they leaned close to inspect the grains and powders. Though they bargained on behalf of masters, they too had a reputation to protect, for to bring home goods that were stale or impure was to invite scorn or dismissal. The servant paused, sniffed the air, and asked for a small bowl of saffron. She knew her mistress would have no use for such a thing, but she could always find a buyer for it in her own circle. When the merchant measured out the saffron with a practiced hand, she hesitated, then asked for a bit more. He might have insisted on more money, but instead he gave her a thread, more than she'd paid for, a silent gift to encourage her return. For in this world of bartering and buying, trust was often built in such quiet exchanges rather than loud boasts. And the next, a scholar approached, his robe ink-stained, his steps measured. He cared little for cooking, but much for the origins of things. And so the merchant spoke not of the uses of ginger or cardamom, but of the weather of the islands, the methods of harvest, the dangers of the roots, and the scholar listened intently, nodding at each detail. His purchases were modest, a handful of cloves, a pinch of nutmeg, but his delight in knowledge was worth more than coin for such men. Carried stories from one circle to another, spreading a merchant's name among those who might one day spend far more. Later, a wealthy matron approached, was veiled and accompanied by attendants who carried her purchases. Her eyes lingered longest upon the saffron, for in her circle it was not merely a flavor, but a symbol of refinement, a way of displaying both wealth and taste at her banquets. And the merchant, recognizing her rank, spoke with the deference she expected, measuring her threads upon a small set of scales polished to a gleam, ensuring that each weight was exact for such customers. Valued precision as much as abundance. Yet even as he sold, he noted how rivals across the lane watched. Him how one whispered into the ear of a potential buyer, perhaps casting doubt upon his wares, how another spread his goods wider as if to outshine him. And he knew that every gain drew envy, every coin invited scrutiny, for the market was as much a contest of endurance as the road or sea had ever been. Still, he held his composure, letting the steady flow of buyers and the honest richness of his goods build the reputation. He sought until by day's end his sack of pepper was noticeably lighter, his measure of saffron diminished, and his pouch of coins heavier than when he began. And as he sat in the fading light, tallying the day's trade, he reflected that here, amid the clamor of splendor, his journey found its true purpose, not merely in the exchange of goods for coin, but in the weaving of connections, the shaping of trust, the quiet recognition that every face, whether servant, scholar, or noble, was part of the great network that gave meaning to his long miles and weary sails. For the merchant understood that the true wealth of the spice trade lay not just in the exotic treasures of the East, but in the bonds that connected him to the world. In the days that followed, as his reputation grew and his name began to pass from one mouth to another in the winding lanes of the spice market, the merchant was invited beyond the stalls and bazaars into the deeper heart of the city, where wealth and influence displayed themselves with a magnificence as dazzling as it was deliberate. He found himself summoned first to the residence of a noble whose banquets were spoken of in whispers of envy. And as he entered the courtyard lined with fountains and carved stone, he realized that here spices were not mere condiments, but declarations of status. For to serve food rich with cinnamon, pepper, or saffron was to proclaim mastery over distant lands. To show that one's wealth extended beyond the walls of the city into the very veins of trade that span deserts and oceans, The noble steward received him with the stern precision of a man accustomed to measuring wealth in both coin and favor. Yet even his sternness softened when the merchant unfurled a small pouch of saffron, its filaments glowing in the sunlight like captured flame. And the negotiation that followed was not merely about weight or price, but about reputation. For the noble would not be known to serve anything less than the finest. And the merchant's calm assurance, his steady recounting of the spice's journey from flour to thread to sack, lent the air of authenticity that turned suspicion into trust. Another day brought him to the gates of a temple where priests in white robes burned incense, whose fragrance curled into the air like prayers made visible. And here he witnessed another transformation of his trade, for in sacred hands, spices were no longer luxuries, but offerings. Their smoke, a bridge between mortal and divine. Their cost measured not in coins, but in devotion. He watched as cinnamon sticks were placed upon the altar, as saffron was ground into water that glowed golden under torchlight. And he marveled that what had once been packed in humble sacks and jostled upon mules or tossed in the belly of a ship now became part of ritual woven into the rhythm of worship itself. Yet perhaps the most striking revelation came when he overheard the murmurs of servants in the noble quarter, who spoke with pride of the dishes flavored by his spices as though they themselves had tasted the refinement, and he understood then that spice was more than food or perfume. It was language and means by which people of rank spoke to one another without words, declaring their sophistication, their reach, their superiority. In these palaces and temples, he saw how the value of spice multiplied, how its worth was magnified not by weight, but by meaning, until a single thread of saffron might stand as proof of power, a pinch of pepper as a sign of wealth, a handful of cinnamon as evidence of connection to lands far beyond the city walls. And though he himself remained a simple trader moving always between road and sea sack and scale, he felt a quiet satisfaction in knowing that his labor, his risks, his endurance had helped shape this theater of splendor, that his goods were the unseen foundation upon which nobles and priests alike built their displays of magnificence. Walking back through the crowded streets past the cries of market sellers and the clatter of carts he carried, this knowledge not with arrogance, but with calm aware that though his name might never be carved upon stone or sung in praise it lived, invisibly in the threads of saffron simmering in noble kitchens in the smoke of cinnamon, curling through temple air in the whispered admiration of those who tasted, smelled, or saw the wealth he had carried across so many miles. As the days turned into weeks, and the rhythm of the city became familiar, the clamor of its streets echoing in his blood, the murmur of its bazaars lulling him almost as if it were a song he'd always known, he began to see not just the marvels that assaulted his senses, the silks smoother than moonlight, the carpets richer than sunsets, the jewels that glittered like captured stars, but also the lives that pulsed beneath these splendors, the merchants in their finery, the artisans with paint on their hands, the nobles in their silken robes, and he understood that they, too, were threads in the great fabric of the city, each contributing their skill or wealth to weave its bustling life. Yet as the weeks turned into months, as he haggled over spices in shadowed bazaars, as he bartered textiles under canopies of gold, as he sipped wine in taverns filled with sailors' tales, he couldn't shake off a disquiet that grew steadily in his heart, a discordant note in the city's harmony. For as he walked the sun-baked streets, he saw not just the silks and spices, but the porters struggling under heavy loads, their bodies stooped under the weight of the city's desires. He heard not just the lilting music drifting from open windows, but the muffled coughs of beggars seeking scraps of food. And he watched not just the nobles feasting in their opulent palaces, but the farmers toiling in distant fields, their backs bent under the sun, their hands calloused by labor. And so it was that as the days turned into weeks and the rhythm of the city became familiar, the merchant began to notice a subtle paradox at the heart of all this magnificence, a contrast that struck him with greater force each time he stood in the grand halls of nobility or the hushed sanctuaries of temples. While the nobles feasted under gilded ceilings and the priests chanted in clouds of perfumed incense, it became increasingly clear to him that these splendid displays, the saffron glowing in sauces, the pepper crackling upon roasted meats, the cinnamon smoldering upon altars, were not miracles born within the city's walls. but treasures carried upon backs bent by labor, a crossroads etched with exhaustion, through seas churned by storms. And he knew intimately the faces of those who paid the hidden cost, for he had walked among the porters whose shoulders bore the sacks, had shared firelight with sailors, whose hands blistered upon ropes, had watched caravan drivers coax weary beasts across merciless sands, and it was their effort, their endurance, that made these luxuries possible, though their names would never be spoken in the noble courts or written in temple ledgers. He, too, had been a nameless face in a crowd until fate had nudged him into prominence. Once, when a shipment had arrived safely at a nobleman's estate, once when a caravan had reached a temple before the annual festival, once when a merchant guild had honored him for averting a disaster, he had basked in the fleeting warmth of recognition, feeling like an ember glowing in the grand hearth of the city. But more often, he was just a cog in the vast machinery of trade, hauling goods up and down rickety stairs, carrying bales through stinking corridors, paying his way through checkpoints with coin that chafed in his purse. Yet even as this truth settled heavily upon him, he realized that this tension between splendor and suffering was the very thread that held the tapestry of trade together, that every glittering feast was bound invisibly to a caravan trudging across sand. Every temple's fragrant smoke tethered to a sailor gripping the mast against the wind. And in this awareness there was a strange kind of solace, for it meant his life, though humble and perilous, was connected to something vast, something enduring. So when the merchant returned to his humble lodging at the edge of the city, resting upon mats that smelled faintly of spice and salt, he did not feel diminished by the grandeur he had witnessed, but rather quietly affirmed, for he had glimpsed the truth behind the splendor, had seen the fragile balance between visible glory and invisible toil. And in that awareness, he felt both the weight and the worth of his journey, as though each grain of spice in his sacks carried not just flavor, but the story of all who had labored to bring it here, himself among them, a thread in the vast, enduring fabric of trade and history. In the quieter years that followed, when the restless urgency of travel had at last given way to the slower rhythms of age, the merchant often found himself seated by the doorway of his modest home, a clay lamp flickering beside him as dusk gathered. And it was in these moments that the full weight of memory pressed most deeply upon him. The journeys that once seemed endless, the ports that once dazzled with noise and color, the deserts that once stretched without mercy, all of these now drifted before him, not as physical landscapes, but as scenes within the theater of the mind, softened by distance, polished by the passing of time. He thought of his youth, when the thrill of setting out upon the road seemed to outweigh the dangers, when every sack of spice was a promise of fortune, when every new city was adored a possibility, and he smiled at the boldness he had carried then, a boldness he now recognized as both his strength and his folly. For in the soft light of old age, he could see more clearly the things he once overlooked. The frightened glance of a caravan boy at the first sound of raiders, the hollow hunger in the eyes of dock workers, waiting for pay the quiet sacrifices of sailors who vanished into storms whose names no one would remember. And he realized that the story of his life was not only about spices and coins and markets, but about the human fabric that bound each journey together. There were faces he could still recall, weathered and worn like pieces of driftwood, each telling a tale of sun and salt and sacrifice. The weathered face of a sailor, his skin tanned the color of dark honey, his eyes holding the gray of distant horizons. The calloused hands of a dock worker, each line and knot a story of cargo handled, of bales and barrels and precious fragile things. The shrewd, smiling face of a fellow merchant, his eyes crinkling at the corners, his hands moving in gestures as intricate as the patterns on his silks. Faces that swam before him now, not as figures in a marketplace, but as souls touched by the same winds of fate that had driven him across the waves and over the sands. He spoke sometimes to the younger traders who came seeking advice, and though they expected tales of riches and cunning bargains, he found himself instead speaking of patience of listening, more than talking of treating every sack not as an object, but as the labor of many unseen hands. And when they asked him whether he regretted the hardships, the long absences, the risks that could so as elite have claimed him, he would pause his gaze, drifting to the horizon as though searching once more for the sails of ships long vanished before answering softly that regret was a strange companion. For while he might have wished at times for a simpler life, He could not deny that the road and the sea had shaped him, had carved into him. A knowledge of the world that no stillness could have given. In this quiet contemplation, the merchant found a different kind of wealth, not measured in gold or silver, but in the richness of experience. He realized that his true treasure was not what he had accumulated, but what he had become. These reflections led him to a deeper understanding of his purpose. In the twilight of his years, the merchant who had once measured his worth in sacks of saffron or bolts of cinnamon began to measure it instead in the words he left behind. In the memories he shared, in the recognition that every journey, however outward in appearance, was also an inward voyage, and that his true cargo, heavier than any spice, was the wisdom gathered along the way. As word of his long journeys spread among neighbors and kin, the merchant found that younger generations often came to him with eager faces, their eyes alight with curiosity, as though the simple act of sitting at his feet might grant them access to the exotic splendors he had once known. He had traversed the great deserts and sailed the unknown seas. He had seen wonders that defied belief and experienced hardships that humbled the soul. And now, these wide-eyed youngsters wanted to hear about it all. To be transported to realms where magic seemed real and adventures unfolded with each turning of the tale. They wished to hear of caravans shimmering like mirages across the desert sands, of ships that seemed to fly upon the waves, of palaces where saffron turned sauces into liquid sunlight, and of temples where cinnamon smoke curled into heaven itself. Well, how he could conjure those things for them. With a sweep of his hand and a twirl of his phrase, he would recreate the taste of dates plucked fresh from palm trees, the feel of silks against his skin, the sound of lutes echoing in moonlit gardens. And as he spoke, their eyes would gleam with wonder, their breaths would quicken, their bodies would lean forward, eager to drink in every last detail. But there were other things he could tell them, things that lay deeper beneath the surface of his memories, things he knew the young did not want to hear, for he remembered those things with clarity. He knew also the long silences that lay between the bustling bazaars, the endless trudging steps, the wounds that festered unseen, the grief of men lost along the way. Yet, when he opened his mouth to speak, he found that these harder truths slid to the background, softened by the haze of memory, while the brighter details rose to the surface like gold sifted from river sand. It was not that he lied, but rather that age had given him a gentler voice, shaping the past not as a ledger of suffering, but as a series of lessons, so that what he offered the young was not despair, but wonder tempered with caution. Still, he sometimes noticed how their gazes drifted when he spoke of patience, of humility, or of the unseen hands that labored to make spices possible. And he realized they were hungry for adventure, for the thrill of storms and bandits and bargains snatched in crowded markets, and so he obliged them, painting his stories with color, giving them the laughter of sailors, the clink of coins upon a tavern table, the shimmer of lamps in a distant bazaar. And he watched their eyes widen, their breaths quicken, their imaginations carry them to places they had never seen. Afterward, when they thanked him, he often smiled to himself, wondering if they understood that the greatest adventure was not in the storm or the bargain, but in the endurance to keep walking long after both had passed. In this way, his stories became mirrors, reflecting back to each listener what they most longed to hear. To the ambitious tales of wealth, to the devout stories of sacred rituals, to the restless journeys across seas, and to the weary reminders of perseverance. Over time, he began to understand that memory itself was a merchant of sorts, trading away pain for wisdom, exchanging suffering for meaning, and smoothing the jagged edges of the past until what remained could be carried forward without bitterness. In this recognition, he felt no shame, for he knew that truth was not diminished by kindness. And if his words left the young with dreams rather than fears, with courage rather than dread, then perhaps this too was a form of legacy, a final gift he could offer after a lifetime spent carrying the gifts of others across the world. In the deepening twilight of his life, when his hands had grown slower and the stiffness in his joints made long walks difficult, the merchant began to think often about inheritance, though not in the way that his neighbors did. For they spoke anxiously of coins to be divided, of fields to be measured, of roofs to be repaired for sons and grandsons. His own house was modest, his savings comfortable but not vast, his possessions few. Beyond the carved chests that still held faint traces of spice in their wood, and he knew that when he was gone, these would scatter easily, absorbed into the lives of others without much remark. But what lingered in his thoughts was not what might be counted or weighed, but what might be remembered. For he had come to see that the true legacy of a life was not the goods one left behind, but the understanding that one's journey had carved into them. He thought of his father, a man who had never traveled farther than the next town, and yet whose patience and steadiness had been the unseen compass of his own restless steps, guiding him long after the man himself had been buried. He thought of the sailors who had taught him how to read the wind, of the caravan leaders who had taught him the language of caution, of the nameless farmers who had taught him, without words, the dignity of labor. None of these men had left him wealth, yet each had left him something far greater. Fragments of wisdom, seeds of perspective, and these, once planted, had grown into the sturdy tree of his life. And so he resolved that his task in these final years was not to hoard what little coin he had, nor to cling to possessions that would one day gather dust in another's home, but to pass forward the stories, the lessons, the quiet recognitions of the road and the sea, to offer them freely to those willing to listen, even if only a handful carried the words in their hearts. For he understood now that every human being was both a traveler and a teacher, whether they wished to be or not, and that to live was to gather fragments from countless others, and in turn to scatter fragments for those who would come after. When he considered his life in this way, he felt no fear of vanishing, for he knew that even if his name faded from memory, some sailor might yet teach patience to a boy, some priest might yet burn cinnamon with reverence, some trader might yet remember to listen more than to boast, and in these small echoes his presence would endure. Inheritance, he realized, was not about possession, but about continuity, about being part of a river that carried wisdom forward, even as the water itself was always changing. And as he sat with his lamp in the dusk, speaking softly to whoever came to hear, he felt himself not at the end of the journey, but as a bridge between the countless voices of the past and the countless voices yet to come, a single thread in the fabric of time whose strength lay, not in its visibility, but in its connection to all the others. As the years advanced and the circle of listeners at his door shifted with time, children becoming youths, youths becoming traders, and traders themselves aging into fathers, he found himself telling the same stories over and over. Each tale was a bead upon the string of his life, strung together with the others to form the necklace of his existence. And yet he noticed a curious thing as he spoke of his adventures in the jeweled city or his escape from the desert's jaws. The words would catch and shift, reshaping themselves around his experiences like water wearing away stone. With each retelling, a storm grew a little wilder, a desert a little harsher, a bargain a little sharper, until he began to feel that the man in the stories was not entirely the man who sat upon the mat, watching the lamp flicker low, but a figure carved slowly by words, smoothed by the expectations of those who listened. Sometimes in quiet moments, he would wonder whether he himself remembered the truth as it had been, or whether the softened, polished versions of his past had taken root even in his own mind, placing the rawness of hunger, the grit of sand in his teeth, the bone-deep weariness of trudging step after step with images gentler, almost noble in their endurance. He would question if he was being dishonest, if the tales he told were a lie born of vanity, or some unconscious desire to seem more than a weathered traveler. But then, a young boy, his eyes wide with wonder, would ask about the scars that pockmarked his hands, or the haunted look in his eyes, and the old merchant would know that his silence would be a greater falsehood than the gentle shaping of his stories. For what are stories but shapeshifters? Beings of myth and moonlight, forever altering to fit the teller and the tale? The old merchant realized that in sharing his life, he was not merely passing on events, but weaving a tapestry of meaning, a mosaic of experience. Each time he told his story, he added a new thread of wisdom, a shard of insight reflecting the myriad facets of life. And so he embraced the evolution of his tales, understanding that, though they may no longer have been the precise record of his days, they carried something truer than fact, the essence of endurance, the shape of wisdom, the meaning woven through the hardships. Still, in the stillest hours of night, when sleep delayed its arrival and the lamp burned low, sometimes let himself remember without speaking, And in those silent recollections, the full weight of the past returned. The sting of salt in the wounds of his hands, the stench of fever in the swamps, the grief of watching a comrade lowered into a shallow grave. Though such memories pressed heavily, he kept them close, knowing they were the roots beneath the tree of the gentler tales. Unseen but essential, grounding what otherwise might drift into fantasy, legacy is not about the accuracy of memory, he mused, but about the balance between what can be endured and what can be passed on. And he carried a quiet gratitude that his life, once filled with perils and uncertainties, now lived on in stories that brought wonder rather than fear, courage rather than despair. Even if the man in the tales seemed at times more heroic than the tired, ordinary traveler he had once been, the final season of his life had begun. The nights grew longer, colder, the weight of years pressing more heavily upon his frame, his steps once eager, now measured, each one a conscious choice. The desert wind that had been his constant companion for decades no longer held the same allure. It whispered of journey's ends, of sands slipping through one's grasp. Yet within this aged merchant, a calmness unexpected, a tranquility born not of resignation but of completion bloomed in his heart. He didn't realize it then, but the desert had mirrored his journey perfectly. Just as the dunes shifted imperceptibly over centuries, so too had he moved through time, being shaped by the world's vastness. He felt it most keenly in the evenings, the golden hues of sunset painting the sky in colors both familiar and poignant. As the day surrendered to night, he'd sit by his open doorway, the rhythmic murmur of the desert settling around him, a lullaby of sorts, a testament to the countless cycles of time he'd witnessed. It was then that he saw it, his life's design woven into the very fabric of the world. Saw it in the faces of the children who sat cross-legged at his door, their eyes wide with wonder as he recounted tales of deserts that shimmered like fire and seas that roared with fury. Their imaginations untamed, soared beyond the confines of their village, carried by his words to horizons unseen. In their innocent wonder, he found a reflection of his own youthful spirit, a reminder of the boundless curiosity that had driven him all those years ago. When he embarked on his epic journey, he saw it too, in the young traders who left his home with thoughtful expressions, repeating quietly to themselves the words he'd spoken about patience, respect, and endurance. For a seasoned traveler knows that the road is as much an internal one as it is physical. And these men, though headstrong and ambitious, carried within them the seeds of doubt and impatience. He'd spoken to them of navigating not just treacherous terrains, but also the labyrinthine paths of human interaction, the shifting winds of fortune, and the importance of staying true to one's core amidst life's myriad distractions. As they walked away, their steps echoing the wisdom he'd shared, he knew that some part of him would forever be etched in their souls, guiding them when coin and courage wavered. And then there were the elders, their faces etched with the passage of time, their eyes holding the wisdom of ages. They came not for adventure, but for reassurance. For life's battles, though varied, are universal. When the body grows weary and the mind seeks solace, what better balm than shared experience? In their quiet nods, he saw understanding. The acknowledgement of struggles echoed across lifetimes. They knew, as he did, that the river of life, though sometimes turbulent, flowed towards a vast and timeless sea. These moments of connection became the anchors in his final season. Anchors that steadied him in the face of the desert's relentless march towards eternity. For he realized it was not in the tangible remnants of his journey, the spices that had long since been consumed, the coins that had passed from hand to hand, nor even the palaces or temples that had glittered briefly in his path, that his legacy lay, but in the invisible threads of memory and perspective that had spun out from his voice into the lives of others. He often thought of the river he had once imagined, the river of inheritance that carried wisdom forward, a silent, ceaseless current that nourished the sands of time. T saw himself not merely as a traveler upon its current, but also a drop of water contributing to its endless flow, merging with countless others, inseparable, yet enduring. This understanding brought him not sorrow, but profound peace. He no longer feared vanishing, no longer clung to the need to be remembered as an individual. He was a part of something vaster, something eternal, and in that realization found his final treasure. As the desert night deepened, His breath slowed, his eyes closing more often than opening. He wasn't afraid. His journey wasn't ending. It was continuing along a road beyond his sight. His presence lingered in the gentle fragrance of stories that would still be told long after his footsteps were gone. Long after the merchant's lamp had burned to ash and the sound of his voice had faded from the small courtyard where he once told his stories, the roads he had traveled remained, stretching endlessly across desert, sea and mountain, carrying new feet, new faces, new voices. Caravans still wound their way through the sand, their bells jingling in the dusk, just as they had in his day and long before it. And ships still tilted against the wind, their sails catching the same restless currents that had carried him from port to port. The world, he realized, even in his final moments, was a stage upon which countless merchants, sailors, priests, and nobles would play their parts, each one believing themselves unique, yet all bound together by the same hunger for connection, for exchange, for meaning woven into goods that traveled farther than their makers could ever imagine. And in this way, his story was not his alone, but part of a far larger tale, one that stretched back to the first trader who bartered salt for grain, and forward to travelers yet unborn who would carry fabrics, metals or spices unknown into markets yet unbuilt. History itself seemed like an endless caravan, moving always forward but carrying within it echoes of the past. The laughter of sailors long drowned, the footprints of porters long buried, the bargains struck beneath lanterns now extinguished. To walk such a road was to belong not merely to one's own age, but to every age, to join a continuity of effort, endurance, an exchange that bound humanity together across centuries. In the grand theater of history, civilizations themselves seemed to rise and fall upon the rhythm of trade, as though the pulse of commerce were the heartbeat of empires. The deserts that once carried only the tracks of wandering tribes grew into corridors of wealth, when caravans carved steady trails across their vastness, linking distant cities with strands of commerce like beads upon a necklace. Ports that had been little more than fishing villages swelled into crowded metropolises, once ships laden with pepper, silk and cinnamon, anchored in their harbors, their warehouses groaning with goods whose origins lay beyond the horizon. Temples were adorned with incense drawn from distant lands, their sanctuaries filled with fragrances that reminded worshippers that the divine could be approached through gifts brought from far away. And palaces glittered, not only with jewels and gold, but with subtler luxuries. The golden glow of saffron in a feast, the sharp bite of pepper upon a noblest tongue, luxuries that proclaimed power more surely than banners or armies. Even wars themselves often traced their roots not to lofty ideals, but to the hunger for control over roads, harbors, and the fragile chains of supply that made luxury possible. In this way, every sack carried by a merchant, every bale loaded onto a ship, every bundle tied to a mule's back became part of a larger current that shaped the destinies of kings as much as it did the lives of sailors. And yet what struck those who reflected upon it was the humility of these agents of change. For most were ordinary men and women, whose names were never written upon stone or scroll, whose faces were never painted, whose voices faded into silence once their work was done. And yet the goods they carried outlived them, passing hand to hand, city to city, until they altered entire cultures without anyone knowing the name of the porter or sailor who had first borne them. In this vast web, each life was a thread, sometimes strong, sometimes fragile, but together weaving a fabric that bound continents, faiths, and peoples into one interlaced story. The spice merchant, whose memory now lingered only in stories told in quiet courtyards, was but one of these threads. Yet in his smallness, he was no less vital, for without countless such threads the web itself could not exist. And so as centuries rolled on and new merchants set their sails, the pattern continued, repeating endlessly. A reminder that the journey of one was always the journey of many, that the road was never truly empty, but forever filled with the echoes of footsteps past and the promise of footsteps yet to come. The objects themselves, humble and mute, seemed to carry with them the secret histories of their journeys. For though a thread of saffron or a stick of cinnamon could not speak, it bore within its fragile body the imprint of countless hands and miles. silent testimony to the labor, the longing, and the risks that had carried it across the world. A bundle of pepper that arrived in a noblest kitchen might have begun its life in the damp heat of a distant jungle. It was plucked by farmers who bent low over the vines, their sweat soaking into the soil. Then it was carried by traders through narrow mountain passes where mules stumbled upon jagged stones. Then it was shipped across seas where sailors fought to keep their vessel afloat through storms that howled like wild beasts. By the time it arrived upon the polished table of a palace, it bore within itself the memory of jungles, deserts, storms, and prayers. Though none of those who tasted it would ever know the fullness of its story. In the same way, a length of silk shimmering beneath the lamplight carried in its weave the echo of the woman who had raised the silkworms, the deftness of the weaver who had spun the threads, the vigilance of the guards who had protected the caravans across hostile lands. Each object was both simple and infinite, at once a material good and a vessel of invisible memory. And though the people who consumed them might have thought only of flavor, texture, or beauty, the goods themselves bore witness to entire worlds of effort and exchange. Perhaps this was why civilizations valued such items so dearly, why they became symbols not merely of wealth, but of connection. For to possess them was to hold in one's hand a fragment of the wider world, to taste in a single mouthful the sweat of farmers, the courage of sailors, the cunning of traders, the blessing of priests. And though the merchants who carried them were often forgotten, and the workers who first raised them rarely remembered, the goods endured, passing silently from one life to another, like seeds of memory scattered across the soil of history. Thus the road was not only endless because of the people who walked it, but because of the goods that carried stories beyond the reach of their makers. Binding humanity together in a chain of silent witnesses, each object a reminder that nothing in the world was ever truly solitary, that every taste, every touch, every fragrance was the echo of lives lived far away, and of journeys that had stretched beyond the horizon. The rhythm of the road, steady and unyielding, did not cease with the passing of one merchant, nor even with the rise and fall of kingdoms. For though empires collapsed into dust and palaces crumbled into silence, the pathways of exchange endured, etched into the land and memory alike. Deserts that once bore camel caravans later carried caravans again, each generation thinking itself new, yet tracing the same footprints of those long forgotten. Ports that had witnessed sails of Egyptian papyrus later received vessels of Roman oak. Then Byzantine galleys, and later still ships heavy with the canvas of distant empires. Yet the cries of sailors calling across the docks sounded much the same, echoing over the waves like a chorus rehearsed for centuries. A road, once carved by feet and hooves, might fall into ruin, but soon another would rise beside it, paved by new rulers yet leading to the same horizon. For the hunger that drove men to move goods across the earth was eternal, woven into the marrow of human desire. No sooner had one route faded than another opened, perhaps longer, perhaps more treacherous, but always carrying within it the same pulse of trade, the same mingling of ambition and need. It was as if the world itself demanded this exchange, as if the soil whispered for pepper and cinnamon, as if the winds asked for silk, as if humanity could not endure within the borders of its own village, but was forever compelled to stretch outward, to seek, to carry, to barter, to return. And in this way, history repeated not in the sense of sameness, but in the sense of rhythm, like the rolling of waves or the rising of dawn. Always different, always the same, each tide unique, yet all bound together in an endless sequence. Thus the road became more than a physical path. It became a kind of memory carved into the earth, one that outlasted rulers, merchants, even civilizations, themselves reminding all who set foot upon it that they were not beginning something new, but merely adding their footsteps to a track already ancient, already worn smooth by countless lives before them. And so, in the echo of hooves across stone, in the creak of ships against their moorings, in the rustle of spices unpacked in the dim glow of a market stall, the world sang again the old refrain, carrying forward the eternal truth that though men come and go, though names vanish into obscurity, the road itself never ends, waiting always for the next traveler, the next story, the next breath of life upon its endless journey. To walk the endless road was to learn, slowly and without words, the quiet truths of existence. It was a humbling and a hopeful education. Nothing lasts forever, yet nothing is ever truly lost. The stones beneath one's feet, ground down by centuries of traffic, had once been new and sharp as flint, quarried by men and shaped by their labor. And those stones would wear down, crumble, and be lost, only to reappear one day, carried by wind or water, and be smoothed by the ceaseless friction until they were indistinguishable from the rest. In this way, the road taught impermanence in its crumbling stones, yet it also taught endurance in its persistence. For when kings quarreled over far-off markets, when merchants' ships were becalmed or broken, when roads were cut by landslides or stormed, still the road itself carried forward a constant thread through shifting patterns of human endeavor long after those who made them had faded into dust. In this way, it seemed to embody both the fragility of human endeavor and its astonishing resilience. But though men quarreled and empires fought and storms destroyed, still the road was there, whispering beneath the feet of the living, offering passage, possibility, and continuity. And so the merchant traveling the endless road learned to live in the present moment, savoring the taste of plums, plucked fresh from a roadside tree, or the feel of warm sand slipping between his toes, while at the same time knowing that these sensations would soon be gone, lost to the relentless march of time, and yet knowing also that, in their passing, they enriched the story of his life, making it more vivid and full. He realized that the road held within it countless stories, not only his own, but those of the countless travelers who had walked this path before him and would continue to do so long after he was gone. He saw the road as a kind of living memory, a repository of the hopes and dreams of countless generations, each leaving their silent testament in the dust. As he walked, he imagined the footsteps of others, heard echoes of their laughter, and the rumble of their voices, felt the shade of their presence walking alongside him, sharing in the journey that bound them all together. And so it was that in his later years the merchant came to understand that he was only a thread in a great weaving one among countless others whose lives intersected and overlapped, creating a pattern too vast for any single person to see. He realized that he was part of a great caravan, not only of merchants and travelers, but of all humanity moving together, exchanging not only goods, but stories, faiths, and memories. Each generation added their own thread to the tapestry, their own experiences and perspectives, their own joys and sorrows, before handing it forward, unbroken, to the next. And just as goods changed hands but retained their essence, so too did wisdom pass silently from one life to another. Not always in books or proclamations, but in the steady continuation of journeys in the simple act of walking the road. Perhaps this was why, in his final reflections, the merchant found no bitterness at his own mortality, for he understood that the road would carry on, and in its carrying it would hold something of him. Not his name, which would soon be forgotten, but the echo of his footsteps. The salt of his sweat mingled with its dust, the faint memory of his laughter in some port where the waves had once answered back. In this sense, the road was not only endless, it was also merciful, for it allowed each life, however small, to become part of something greater, a continuity that stretched beyond the boundaries of time, uniting the living with the dead, the past with the future, and the solitary with the whole. There was in the road a rhythm not unlike a lullaby, soft and steady, that could soothe even the most restless heart if one paused long enough to listen. The shuffle of footsteps upon sand, the clop of hooves upon stone, the creak of leather straps and wooden wheels all blended together into a music that repeated across the centuries, a music without beginning or end. It carried the traveler forward like the tide carries a drifting boat. Even storms, wars, and the collapse of cities could not silence it for long, for always, once the dust had settled. The song began again, quiet at first, then swelling as new voices joined in. A caravan gathering at dawn, a ship's crew raising the sail, a farmer trading his grain for a handful of spice. The merchant in his later years often thought that this was what the gods themselves must have heard when they bent their ears to the earth. Not the shouts of kings or the clash of armies, but the low, persistent murmur of humanity moving, trading, sharing, surviving. It was a melody that asked for nothing grand, yet gave everything essential. A reminder that though individual journeys ended, the song of the road continued, carrying each life forward into memory and then into silence, And perhaps this was why the road felt almost like a living being itself, patient, and enduring as though it cared not for victory or failure, but only for continuity, for the quiet persistence of movement and exchange. Those who walked upon it might believe themselves weary, lost, or forgotten, yet the road never judged, never abandoned. It simply stretched onward, waiting, welcoming, whispering softly that no traveler was ever truly alone. In its dust lay the echoes of countless others who had walked before, and in its horizon, the promise of countless others yet to come. And so each step, no matter how heavy, was also part of a larger dance, a larger harmony. In this way, the road became a comfort not only to the body, but to the spirit, lulling even the anxious merchant into a kind of peace. As though he too had become part of the lullaby, his life's footsteps folded gently into the eternal rhythm, his heart finally beating in time with the endless song. And when the merchant's eyes closed for the last time, it was not the walls of his house, nor the coins in his chest that lingered in his mind, but the road itself. Long, sunlit stretches where the horizon shimmered like a promise. Narrow mountain passes where echoes of laughter and prayer were swallowed by stone. Silent deserts where stars burned cold above the shifting sand. Busy ports alive with fragrance voices and the cry of gulls. All of it returned to him in a single breath, as if the road had come to gather him gently, to fold him back into its endlessness. And with this final vision came a strange peace, for he understood at last that he had never truly owned his journey nor the spices he carried, nor even his stories, but had only borrowed them for a while to bear them onward until others were ready to take them further. He was no more and no less than a single traveler among countless millions, and yet that was enough for the road itself remembered holding in its dust the faint trace of his passing, carrying it forward as part of the great chorus of humanity's movement across time. And when his memory faded from the lips of others, when even his name vanished into silence, the road would remain, stretching onward beneath other feet, whispering the same lullaby of continuity, carrying new lives toward new horizons, yet always with the echo of those who had come before. Thus, the merchant became not a man lost, but a thread woven into the vast and endless fabric of history, invisible yet essential. His life's song folded seamlessly into the greater music. And so the final image was not of an ending, but of a road, long and quiet, stretching beneath the fading light of evening, its stones warm with memory, its horizon open and waiting. A road without beginning, a road without end, upon which all travelers walk in turn, each step dissolving into silence, each silence adding to the whole, until the world itself seems to breathe with the rhythm of its passing. And as the story closes, as the last lamps dim and the listener drifts toward sleep, the road remains steady, eternal, carrying the soft murmur of history forward, guiding all who dream upon it toward rest, reminding them that though each journey ends, the path itself goes on forever. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more videos.